Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Momentum builds for a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas as a final draft of the deal is provided by mediators. Washington prepares for the return of Donald Trump with 1 week to go until his inauguration ceremony. Ukraine's president offers to swap captured North Korean soldiers for Ukrainians held by Russia. And blast not, Jeff Bezos's anticipated Blue Origin rocket launch is postponed during the mission control countdown after a vehicle subsystem issue. To our top story, and a ceasefire agreement could be reached between Israel and Hamas after mediators in Qatar provided a final draft to end the war in Gaza. Current US President Joe Biden spoke to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the phone over the weekend, stressing the importance of a ceasefire and a return of the hostages. Meanwhile, UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy is in Israel to discuss the matter with his Israeli counterpart. Al Arabiya spoke to Lammy ahead of his trip. Here's what he had to say.
We have been calling for a ceasefire since December of last year. We want to see that ceasefire. We want to see a hostage deal. We want to see the intolerable suffering of the people of Gaza come to an end and a surge in aid. And we are pressing, and I will be going on to Israel to speak to the leadership in Israel to see if we can bridge the gap. We must bring this devastating war to an end. I think there has been progress. I think we are close to a deal.
Let's go live to Tel Aviv now and speak to our correspondent Sarah Coates. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. The UK and the US are pushing for a ceasefire deal, and Gideon Saar has said progress is being made in the ongoing negotiations. Give us the latest on the mediators' draft and when we could see an agreement actually be reached.
Hello there, Leigh Ann. There certainly is growing optimism here in the region that a deal could potentially be achieved over the coming hours, if not the coming days. Now, what we can report, according to Israeli officials, is that Hamas has now handed over a list of living hostages, something that it has said it previously could not do. Now, in addition to this, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reportedly made a number of concessions, one of these being the names of these Palestinian prisoners that would be released from Israeli jails in exchange for these Israeli hostages, and also Israeli presence on the Philadelphia corridor, something that really was a major sticking point before. Now, also, just over the last hour or so, there has been confirmation that the Israeli officials have actually come out, told 3 hospitals here in Israel to prepare for the arrival of hostages, really sort of indicating, Leigh Ann, that a deal could be imminent.
There is some pushback in Israel to a deal. What more can you tell us on this, Sarah?
Certainly, this is very unsurprising. It's the same thing that we've been seeing time and time again throughout all of these negotiations. This is from the far right. This is Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, and also the national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. They have come out very strongly against this proposal, against any kind of deal, saying that it would be a catastrophe. But Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, he does have a safety net here. Now, this is from the opposition leader, Yair Lapid. He's come out to say that if they pull out of the government, which they are threatening to do, if Netanyahu does make a deal, that he would step in and potentially save this coalition. So really, the big question here is, will there be a deal? When will it happen? And will the Israeli government survive, Leigh Ann?
I feel like we've been in this position before, but Netanyahu also met Donald Trump's incoming Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff. Is Netanyahu's willingness to now reach a deal with Hamas linked to the friendship he had with Trump in his first presidency and the fact that they want to carry that on?
I think there are a few very important points here, one of these being that the incoming President Donald Trump does not want to inherit this war that's been dragging on for more than 15 months with more than 46,000 people killed. We also do need to remember that he will be returning to the White House with a number of priorities for the Middle East, one of these being exerting this maximum pressure campaign on Iran, another really trying to expand on the Abraham Accords and bring in key players, normalization between key players like Saudi Arabia and Israel, and finally to get this relationship between Israel and the United States back on track. So really, once again, this is a critical point for these negotiations. We do understand that Hamas has potentially handed over its answer to the Israelis, to these key mediators. This is being denied as we go to war by Israel, but certainly, once again, critical hours ahead. Leigh Ann.
Sarah Coates in Tel Aviv, thank you so much for joining us. US President Joe Biden is wrapping up his commitments from Washington, D.C. a week before the next president, Donald Trump, is due to be officially sworn in. There are suggestions he will take a call with Russian President Vladimir Putin as he prepares for a promised peace deal on Ukraine before he heads back to the White House. Caroline Malone reports.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear
that in a week there will be scenes similar in Washington, D.C. 8 years ago, Donald Trump was sworn in as U.S. president for the first time. He is returning to the White House with a similar outlook.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first.
After campaigning to reduce government spending and increase efficiencies, tackle illegal immigration and boost border security, Donald Trump had pledged to expel up to 20 million immigrants without legal status. But the incoming border czar has told Republicans to temper their expectations due to the cost of doing that. Russia and any potential deal with Ukraine is front and center. Incoming National Security Advisor said he expects a call between Mr. Trump and President Vladimir Putin in the coming days.
Well, we would like to see a ceasefire in any minute, any day. I think that would be an incredibly positive first step on both sides. And that would then allow us to enter into the framework of some type of negotiated solution here. Everybody knows that this has to end somehow diplomatically. I just don't think it's realistic to say we're going to expel every Russian from every inch of Ukrainian soil.
The inauguration in Washington, D.C. is expected to be calmer than 4 years ago, when President Joe Biden was sworn in the aftermath of the January 6th Capitol riots by Trump supporters. He has been wrapping up his own policy, including adding sanctions on Russia's oil for its war on Ukraine.
These are the last days that Biden has before he hands over to President-elect Trump, and so his team is looking to take as many steps as they can to strengthen Ukraine's position and perhaps even to try and limit the scope for the Trump administration to roll back or to soften the US stance on Russia.
Joe Biden is due to speak at the State Department and make a final speech at the Oval Office on Wednesday.
Democracy is fragile.
Donald Trump's inauguration events begin on Saturday with a fireworks display and reception at his National Golf Club in Virginia. On Sunday, there'll be a wreath-laying ceremony in Arlington National Cemetery before a victory rally in D.C. Then he's due to be officially sworn back in on January 20th at midday. Caroline Malone, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has made an offer to release 2 captured North Korean soldiers in exchange for Ukrainian soldiers being held in Russia. It comes as South Korea says that more than 3,000 North Korean troops have been killed or injured in Russia's war against Ukraine. Here's a reminder of just what Zelensky had to say.
The security service of Ukraine continues to work with prisoners from North Korea. One of them expressed a desire to stay in Ukraine. The other one wants to return to North Korea. If Kim Jong-un remembers these citizens at all and can arrange an exchange for our soldiers who are held in Russia, we can transfer such soldiers.
Has more on this story from Tokyo.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's office has said that Russia is trying to hide the fact that North Korean soldiers are fighting in the war. And President Zelensky is saying that he's willing to make an exchange offer to hand back 2 North Korean soldiers who were captured earlier this month and are injured in exchange for Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russia. Moscow hasn't denied that it is using North Korean troops in its war against Ukraine. And on Monday, a South Korean lawmaker briefed by the National Intelligence Service has revealed that it's believed that there are some 300 deaths and 2,700 injuries of North Korean soldiers fighting alongside Russia against Ukraine. And apparently North Korean authorities have told their soldiers that they should blow themselves up, commit suicide to evade capture, according to South Korea's spy agency. This comes as there are growing concerns among Western countries about Russia's strengthening relationship with North Korea, and it also follows South Korea last week saying that North Korea had carried out a missile test.
Rebecca Bundhan there in Tokyo. Thank you very much. Now, at least 24 people have died and more than 100,000 others are under evacuation orders as firefighters continue to tackle the Los Angeles wildfires. High winds are expected in the area this week, which could further fan the flames. California's Governor Gavin Newsom has called the wildfires the most devastating natural disaster in U.S. history. Let's go live to our US correspondent, Sally Patterson. Sally, thank you so much for being with me this evening. Sally, firstly, winds are picking up again this week. How are fire services and the authorities preparing for this?
Well, we're just finishing up a news conference which officials are using to give the latest updates on these fires, which are continuing to tear through parts of California. Now, the key message that we're hearing on Monday is we are not out of the woods yet. We are not in the clear. And officials are asking residents to continue to stay cautious and stay alert. In particular, they're saying do not go back to your residences, even if you think they're safe, because actually you might not be out of danger yet. Please wait and listen to instructions given to you by officials in the area. Now, what we're also hearing is that there is the firefighters, there is the water, and there is the resources needed to battle these fires. But what officials say is that they need a break from Mother Nature. That's what they're going to need over the next few days as high winds are expected to pick back up again. We're expecting some very strong winds on Tuesday night local time going into Wednesday morning, which could set back efforts to try and control these fires. But they're saying this is a time now both crucial for tackling existing fires and trying to prevent any new ones from starting.
It's been estimated that the damage estimates have now surpassed $250 billion. What has the government said on how they're going to start funding this and what the rebuilding program is actually going to look like?
Well, this is expected to be one of the costliest natural disasters ever in U.S. history. We're already in the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of damage. And we're hearing from the federal government that they will continue to push investment into the recovery efforts. They say they're going to fund, for example, 100% of the efforts to remove debris and help with this immediate emergency situation. But we do need to remember that in just a week's time, we're going to have a different president of the United States in the White House, and it will be up to him what the federal response is, at least, to the recovery efforts. Now, Donald Trump, who is the incoming president of the United States, hasn't always had the best relationship with the governor of California, Gavin Newsom. And over the weekend, we saw the two men exchanging words on social media and also in statements. Newsom invited Trump to come and see the damage for himself, meet some of those first responders. But he says that he hasn't heard back yet from Donald Trump himself. And the president-elect, in his way, has said he's been peddling some misinformation about what's going on with the fires, why there wasn't enough water to tackle the blazes, and really taking aim at Newsom there. So we'll have to see how that plays out as Donald Trump goes into the White House, and responsibility, at least in part, for the cleanup goes to him.
Sally, police have been issuing warnings about looters last week. We've been hearing that criminals have been dressed up as firefighters to gain access to people's home. The LAPD have also spoken about the increase in scammers, with some offering fake job offers, others asking for payments and donations over the phone. What advice is being given, and how can people stay safe from this?
Well, I think it's important to note that the overwhelming response to this disaster has been one of support and love pouring out from local residents and indeed people across the country, giving donations, money, food, other resources, even opening up their homes to those who've been displaced in these fires. But there are a few people who've tried to take advantage of the situation. As you say, looters going into houses where the residents have evacuated and taking what they can. People have taken matters into their own hands, putting up signs outside their properties saying looters will be shot. They've also been hiring individual security guards to come and stand outside whilst they're not in the property. Police say at least 20 people have been arrested for looting. There's also been cases of people wearing fake responding uniforms, so fire uniforms and police uniforms as well, which has been condemned, of course, by authorities there. There are situations as well where people have been scamming those victims of the fires, pretending to be charities or non-profits who are helping people displaced in the fire. Now, what we're hearing from authorities in the region is for people to do their research before donating to any of these so-called charities. We know that GoFundMe, which is a fundraising website, has been verifying people on there themselves so that they know donors can give money with confidence. But they are stressing that people should take care when contributing and try not to give cash. Instead, they should use traceable forms of donations instead.
Sally Patterson, thank you so much for joining me. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. Nawaf Salam, head of the International Court of Justice, has been chosen as Lebanon's new prime minister. The decision comes days after the country's parliament announced army commander Joseph On as president. Salam's appointment will come as a blow to Hezbollah, who wanted the incumbent Najib Mikati to remain in power. A tsunami warning has been issued in Japan after an earthquake of 6.9 magnitude rocked an area of Kyushu earlier today. Miyazaki Prefecture, where the quake was centered, as well as the nearby Kochi area, are in the danger zone. Authorities have urged locals not to enter the sea or approach the coast until the advisory is lifted. The UK's first drug consumption room has opened in Scotland today as the country's government attempts to reduce the number of drug-related deaths. The Glasgow facility will allow users to take drugs under medical supervision and with a clean and hygienic environment. There were over 1,000 drug misuse deaths in Scotland in 2023, a 12% rise on the previous year. And Meghan Markle's new Netflix show has been postponed because of the Los Angeles wildfires. The lifestyle series with Love Meghan was due to premiere this week but will now air on the 4th of March. The Duchess of Sussex said it was important to focus on the needs of those impacted by the wildfires in her home state of California. Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin rocket launch was postponed earlier today after a vehicle subsystem issue. The 30-story tall launcher was due to take off from the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, but was called off after a few anomalies during the mission countdown. Bezos believes his company could become a rival to Elon Musk's SpaceX. I'm now joined by the astronomer, Mark Thompson, to talk to me about this a little bit more. Mark, thank you so much for joining me. Well, listen, all that hype and excitement. I was sitting on my sofa. I couldn't wait. I'm sure much of the world were with me. And we didn't get a chance to see liftoff at all. What happened? What went wrong?
Well, do you know what? This happens so many times that we sit there with bated breath waiting for a multitude of different missions to launch into space, and then something goes wrong. It did happen to Elon Musk, and it's now happened to Jeff Bezos. We don't yet know the details of the failure that they experienced, but there are so many different subsystems on board, modern-day rockets, from propulsion to guidance. And so we just have to sit and wait for the report to come out, which will hopefully follow in a few days' time.
Yes, they're saying a few anomalies. Private companies are dominating the space race. That's something we've been talking about now for years. SpaceX is the most successful to date. Can Blue Origin actually rival Elon Musk at this stage, or is it just far too late in the game now?
No, not at all. There's still a little way to go for Bezos to be, a real rival to the Musk empire. He's got the landing of the booster systems down to a T. As of course Elon Musk has seen that with the Starship launches and subsequent landings, both on platforms based on the ocean, but also on land-based sort of landing systems, and that makes it massively cheaper to take satellites up into orbit and, of course, ultimately humans. So, but it's not too late at all for Bezos. He's not far off now, reaching the same state as Elon Musk. So, fingers crossed he'll get there. It's always good to have a bit of competition after all.
I don't know if Elon Musk would like that, except he did say good luck. Yeah. Why is the New Glenn rocket the one to watch in the world of space? So much hype about this rocket.
I think it's because it's the second system now. So we've seen Elon Musk manage to land a booster previously in the days of the Apollo missions that took astronauts to the moon. The booster system, the biggest part of the rocket that got the astronauts away from the gravities of the Earth's gravity, they weren't reusable. They ended up quite often just floating down on a parachute and being lost in the ocean. But now, of course, we've got this wonderful design where the rocket booster can land again and be filled up with fuel again and reused, and it drives the cost down remarkably. So to have another company out there with another reusable launch system is really good to help drive the cost down, and ultimately that can help with making space more accessible for companies and also individuals who might want to experience that wonderful, what is probably at the moment less than once in a lifetime experience.
That moves me on to my next question. Why does Amazon founder Jeff Bezos and so many tech entrepreneurs want to explore space? And will we, as mere mortals, ever be able to visit the moon or live on Mars?
Yeah, well, I think, unfortunately, it's driven largely by financial gain. But a lot of things in the world of commerce are driven by financial gain. There's a massive market in being able to send satellites up into orbit. Of course, previously it was just down to perhaps the sort of research of the space environment, but we're seeing more and more companies wanting to launch research and development modules or satellites up into orbit, so that all manner of different exercises can be undertaken. So there's a real benefit in companies wanting a launch system, and of course, if you can be one of those players to offer a cheap launch capability, then there's financial gain in that. And of course, we've already seen that, for £250,000 you can get yourself up into experience weightlessness up in space. You're only kind of a 90-minute flight up and down. But space tourism is also going to be driven largely by advances in space technology, which commercial space organisations are doing a wonderful job at. And that's the second part of the question. One day, yes. Who knows when? Certainly space tourism is a massive aspect to commercial spaceflight, and we're going to see changes in the future. Whether it will hit our generations or not, I just don't know. I think we'll see in the next few decades, we'll see people in orbit, perhaps being able to holiday in orbit. I think it might be a little bit of a time before we get to visit the moon or Mars.
I always wanted to go to the Maldives on holiday, not quite into orbit. Astronomer,
you need to have some greater ambitions, I think.
Yes, I think so too. Astronomer Mark Thompson there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a look at some of the top business news. Oil has extended gains for a third session, with Brent rising above $80 a barrel to its highest in more than 4 months. It's been driven by wider US sanctions on Russian oil and the effects on exports to top buyers, India and China. Chinese and Indian refineries have sought alternatives to Russian oil from the Middle East, Africa and also the Americas. Apple is asking investors to vote against a proposal to end its diversity, equity and inclusion programs. It comes after a conservative group called on the tech giant to abolish the policies. The National Centre for Public Policy Research says they are exposing firms to litigation, reputational and financial risks. Meta and Amazon have rolled back similar programs ahead of Donald Trump's return to the White House. And let's have a look at the sports news today. And Novak Djokovic has survived a little bit of a scare in his first round of the Australian Open to actually serve it out to take a victory. Wildcard Nashesh Basavaredi really made the win difficult for the 7th seed Djokovic. Meanwhile, British star Jacob Fernley beat injury-hit home favourite Nick Kyrgios. He was embarking on his long-awaited comeback in Melbourne. And Arina Sabalenka powered past Sloane Stephens to begin her quest for a third consecutive Australian Open. And British boxing legend Tyson Fury has announced he is retiring from the ring at the age of 36. The self-proclaimed Gypsy King is hanging up his gloves after a second defeat to Alexander Usyk last month. Announcing the news on Instagram, Fury said it had been a blast and he had loved every single minute of it. Now, the world's biggest religious gathering, the Kumbh Mela, is underway in India, with close to 400 million people likely to attend the 6-week-long festival. It's been called the Grand Kumbh Mela this year, as it takes place after 12 years. This rare Hindu event is considered more sacred by the devotees, as it's been held at the confluence of India's 2 holiest rivers, the Ganga and the Yamuna. Ishan Garg tells us about the scale of the event and the preparations from New Delhi.
70 to 80 million people, that's more than twice the population of Saudi Arabia, will attend the Maha Kumbh Mela just this week. The month-and-a-half-long event is being held in India's most populous state, Uttar Pradesh. As the festival kicked off on Monday, tens of thousands took a dip in the holy waters in the Prayagraj city. Devotees believe offering prayers at the confluence of the rivers Ganga and Yamuna during this auspicious period will bring them closer to salvation. It's a key tenet of the Hindu faith, which is why pilgrims from all across the world are making their way here, including some 1.5 million foreign tourists as well. The government has set up a whole new city to accommodate them. Spread over 4,000 hectares, this tent city will accommodate millions of pilgrims. Some 50,000 security personnel are being deployed here. and thousands of CCTV cameras enabled with artificial intelligence and facial recognition technology will scour the area for any disturbance in real time. With tens of millions arriving here on the busier days, stampede and overcrowding are a major concern. And officials say they are tracking social media websites in real time to counter the spread of misinformation that could potentially result in a catastrophe. The event is expected to have a mega impact on the country's economy. Analysts expect it to fetch the state government some $3 billion in revenue, and then there are political implications as well. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party, which came to power in the country and also in this state on plank of Hindu nationalism, could actually benefit from this gathering. The government says it wants the event to showcase India's Hindu culture and heritage on an international scale. And successful completion of the world's biggest religious event could solidify Mr. Modi's position as a favourite among his Hindu majority voter base. Ishan Garg for Al Arabiya News, New Delhi.
A reminder of our top stories. Momentum built for a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas as a final draft of the deal is provided by mediators. Washington prepares for the return of Donald Trump with 1 week to go until his inauguration ceremony. Ukraine's president offers to swap captured North Korean soldiers for Ukrainians held by Russia. And blast not, Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin rocket is postponed during the mission control countdown after a vehicle subsystem issue. Thank you, and that is all from us on W News. Thank you for joining us. Riz Khan is coming up next. And don't miss our special interviews with the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy and Geir Pedersen, the UN Special Envoy to Syria. Tom Burges Watson will also be here with a GNT. Good night, and thank you for joining me.
Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. So how has 2025 begun for you? Are you still feeling optimistic about the year ahead? Are your New Year's resolutions standing firm, or have they already broken on the rocks of reality? Well, don't worry, things could be worse, and in this episode we'll tell you how. As Donald Trump lays out his vision for changing the global map, we'll take a look at the prospects for the world in 2025. Later, we'll sit down with Pascal Lamy, who ran the World Trade Organization for almost a decade and now dedicates himself to promoting a peaceful world. But we start with Ian Bremmer, whose Eurasia Group produces an annual countdown for the top risks facing our planet. It's keenly anticipated by governments and strategists alike. Ian, thank you very much for joining the show. Now, last year, around this time, we had a wonderful conversation about your global risk predictions for 2024 in what you described as the Voldemort of years, you know, the year that should not be mentioned because of all the terrible things that would happen. Looking back on it, I know a lot changes during the year and a lot of unexpected things happen, but how did your predictions compare with what actually happened in 2024?
You know, we always keep our risks report up on our homepage all year long. And then we go back at the end of the year and want to see if we, call balls and strikes and see what we can learn. I I would say that the top risks all came out pretty much exactly as we expected. I mean, we said very unpopularly, we said Ukraine was likely to be partitioned. Heading towards that. That seems almost certain at this point. It's not what we want to see, but it's certainly where we think it's going. We thought the Middle East war was going to expand dramatically from where it was back in January. That's obviously played out over the course of the year, not just in Gaza, but also much more broadly in Lebanon and with the Houthis and the rest. And we thought this was going to be an incredibly divisive time inside the United States, the U.S. versus itself. And of course, we were this close to the U.S. president-elect being assassinated in the United States, and the level, the animus within the U.S. Politically, as the U.S. system is in many ways in crisis, has played out. I think the big thing that we were surprised by was just how much worse the Chinese economy turned out than we expected. We knew it was doing badly, but it's been a much deeper challenge. And that has meant, for example, we thought in 2024 that there was going to be a much bigger fight over critical minerals and supply chain, because the world is moving away from a free market towards more industrial policy. But you don't fight as much over critical minerals if nobody wants to buy them. And the fact is that Chinese consumer demand fell off a cliff. So, I mean, that as a risk, frankly, I think is a longer term concern. But looking in my rearview mirror, I wouldn't have put that in the list for 2024. And I would have put the China risk up a couple ticks from where it was in the report back last year. Also, I was particularly pleased that we listed U.S.-China relations as a herring. I mean, this was a relationship. You had, the balloon getting, knocked out of the sky, and you had Nancy Pelosi traveling to Taiwan. But actually, the last year of U.S.-China relations were far better managed by both the Americans and the Chinese, with 25 high-level channels of dialogue established between the two, kind of recreating the old strategic and economic dialogue, and even military channels. So no trust was built, but a level of stabilization in the relationship did play out over 2024, notwithstanding the fact that the U.S. didn't give away the store to the Chinese in any way. So it was one of Biden's few foreign policies that generally he got good marks from both Democrats and Republicans, Riz.
Well, Ian, I one thing that struck me very much in 2024 is everyone talking about the divisions within the U.S. and that risk you had, the U.S. versus itself, really stuck with me. I remember we talked about it. Did the election being so decisive in favor of Donald Trump really mitigate that risk?
I think it helped. I mean, it's so decisive is an overstatement. Trump did not get 50% of the popular vote. He got slightly less. So, that is not a country where the voters are telling you we all want Trump. That's not what America was saying. In fact, I mean, if you looked at elections all over the world, incumbents got hit everywhere. Kamala Harris actually performed better than most incumbents did. I mean, if you were an alien looking down on the world, you would have asked, why did Harris perform so well compared to all of these other incumbents? And it doesn't matter to Americans, obviously, given the outcome. And the answer, I think, is largely, number one, because the U.S. economy was performing so much better than so many of those other economies coming out of the pandemic. And also because Trump was such a divisive character inside the United States. And you had people even going for third parties, which is very unusual in the U.S. I think the RFK endorsement meant a lot. In fact, I would say that RFK probably mattered more for Trump's election than Elon did, despite his $250 million, which, ain't nothing at the end of the day. But yeah, I mean, I think looking ahead to 2025, Riz, one thing that is really interesting is that these three big wars, Russia, Ukraine, Middle East, and the U.S. versus the U.S., are all sort of ebbing, right? I mean, it's not like the Israelis have much else to hit in Gaza. And, we've got a ceasefire with Hezbollah that may not hold, but I'd be surprised if the war breaks out the way it did in the early days in the fall. Russia, Ukraine, I think there's a decent chance we get a ceasefire over the course of 2025, even though it's probably going to take a little longer than the 24 hours that Trump promised in his campaign. And the United States versus itself. Well, even though it was a very close election, Americans do not believe it was rigged. They say it was free, it was fair, and Trump is their president. They may not like it, but he won. And so, his win was actually perceived as more legitimate than, frankly, by the Americans as a whole, than either Biden's or Trump's in the last two cycles. So, there are a lot of things to worry about in 2025, but the risks that were front and center for everyone in 2024 have actually receded.
Well, you gave me the considerations you'd put forward in looking at your 2025 risk. Let's go through the countdown, because that's always the fascinating part, starting with number 10. Which you describe as Mexican standoff. It seems that the US's neighbor is going to have a painful time in 2025.
Yeah, it's going to be tougher. Look, the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, who is quite impressive in my view, she really doesn't want a fight with the United States. And she is looking to do things that will make Trump feel like he's getting a deal. In other words, she's going to try to appease him. Right? I said this is about as dangerous as we've had a world since the 30s, and appeasement is the word of the day in how to respond to Trump for countries around the world. I've already seen this. I was in Mexico a few weeks ago, and they're trying to figure out how to hit the Chinese so they can take Chinese goods off the Mexican market and not have them pass through to the United States. They want to give that to Trump. They recognize they need to do more on fentanyl. They need to do more on their own southern border so fewer illegal immigrants come through Mexico to the U.S. They're prepared to do that. But AMLO had a pretty good relationship with Trump. He was on the left, but he was a populist. He was the same generation, kind of gruff but engaging and charismatic. They liked each other. Sheinbaum is a PhD environmental scientist who graduated from Berkeley. And she's a woman. It would be hard for you and I to find a demographic that Trump is likely to consider more problematic than her. So they're not going to get on personally well. And there are a lot of demands being made by the U.S. The trade deficit is a lot greater this time around. The China issue is pretty serious and hard to resolve. And the U.S. is in a stronger position. So, and also interesting, the USMCA, which needs to be renegotiated, the Canadians coming in, the likely new conservative Canadian government, would be very happy to negotiate bilaterally with the U.S. and throw Mexico under a bus. So, look, I think Mexico-U.S. relations will eventually get to the right place, and they will figure this out. But 2025 is going to be choppier between these two than a lot of people are expecting.
Now, number 9 is an intriguing one. Ungoverned spaces. What does that really encompass?
Well, in what we call a G0 world, the law of the jungle, where you are moving away from international rule of law and common values and standards, you end up with a lot of places that people forget about that aren't really governed. Like Sudan, where 25 million people are living under humanitarian crisis, and over 8 million have been displaced. Like Yemen, like Libya, like Gaza, of course, and the West Bank, like big swaths of Ukraine that have been destroyed and mined, but a lot of Ukrainians and Russians are still living there. Like Haiti, right next to the United States, that no one is really doing anything about. The Kenyans sent a few hundred peacekeeping troops, but the gangs have taken over, basically. Myanmar, with a big fight between a lot of ethnic minorities and a military junta that the Chinese are very uncomfortable about, but no one's able to stop the fighting. So what we're seeing is larger and larger numbers of people around the world that are living in functionally ungoverned spaces. And it's not one of the top risks in the world because, frankly, these places don't have a lot of economic importance and aren't critical for national security, but of the big powers. But they matter, and they're starting to matter more. There's also ungoverned spaces that aren't about individual countries, but are instead about, outer space and everyone launching satellites, but not having agreements about the rules of the road there, or under seas, and all of these pipelines and fiber cables that are getting damaged by rogue actors, some of whom are states, some of whom are non-state actors. So, as you see a breakdown of global governance, you see implications for public goods, both for individual human beings and for society as a whole.
Now, with artificial intelligence, I guess that was inevitable, going to be somewhere on the list. You've put number 8 as AI unbound, which makes it sound a little terrifying.
I'm a big enthusiast about AI. I think it's incredible, the use cases that we're seeing growing every day for expanding human capital and also for improving industrial innovation in every sector in every country. So I think it's still undersold from that perspective, despite, a lot of hype and a lot of froth. But I also know it's undergoverned. And this year, last year, there was a lot of focus on we need to prioritize this governance. The Brits, put their flag down and said we want to have an AI safety summit every year, and that's how we're going to make a difference. This year, they've rebranded it. It's now being called an AI action summit. That tells you a lot. The Europeans as a whole feel like they focus too much on regulation. They're being left behind in the AI race, and they want to spend more. They want to engage more, innovate more. The Americans, Trump is probably going to rip up the executive order on AI that Biden did with the 7 systemically important AI companies in the U.S. And the U.S.-China dialogue on AI, which was hard to get started and only in its infancy, is likely not to go forward in the Trump administration and its relationship with Xi Jinping. So you're going to end up with an AI arms race between the Americans and the Chinese, which will remind you of what we had with the Soviets before the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's a lot faster moving. And you'll also have a lot of tinkerers and bad actors that will download their American or European chatbots, and they'll customize them without the safety regs that they have. We've already started playing with these internally for analysis. And we're seeing it's very easy to ask an AI bot today, how do you kill somebody with arsenic? It's very easy to figure out how one would go about assassinating a CEO. We're not trying to do that, but there are people out there that are, and clearly we're not going to have any governance until the crisis comes. And that's where we are on AI right now.
That's a terrifying thought, actually, where it could go. Now, with number 7, you have an interesting term, beggar thy world. What did that mean?
Beggar thy world means that with the Americans who are looking to put tariffs on other countries and looking to force other countries to decouple their national security-related economic investments from China, but the Chinese have an economy that is faring badly, and that the only part that's really producing is a significant export manufacturing sector, everybody in between gets squeezed. We're living in a world where everybody wants to do open business with the Americans and the Chinese, and that's becoming much harder as the Chinese and Americans export very different political and economic strategies that are exclusive. They're mutually exclusive. So it means that other countries are going to have a harder time, and they're going to have a harder time with economies that have not fully recovered from the pandemic, with higher interest rates and higher debt levels. We've already seen in Brazil, if you make a little mistake on your fiscal environment, your markets will take a hit, your currency will take a hit. The UK is suffering for this right now. The French government is suffering for this. The Canadian government fell because of this. It wasn't because of Trump. It was actually the fiscal crisis. And then Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister, basically shooting Trudeau in the face. That is a challenge that lots of developing countries and advanced industrial economies are going to be facing that pressure in 2025.
Now, you've got Iran in there as number 6, Iran on the ropes. You see it as having weakened quite a lot over the past year, don't you?
I think I'm hard-pressed to find a large country that has weakened more than Iran has. They've lost their empire. The axis of resistance has been basically destroyed by Israel with American help, and Assad by HTS with Turkish help. And so, I mean, that was the way they projected power. as someone who studied the Soviet Union in the late 80s through its collapse in 91, Iran to me right now seems to be right about 1989, when the Soviets lost the Eastern Bloc and they no longer had a credible story internally, economically, politically, or geopolitically for their own people. That's where Iran is right now. They have an 85-year-old supreme leader who is in bad health and hasn't declared a direct successor yet. There's going to be competition there. Certainly, the Iranians know how to repress their people, and I expect that they will continue to as their problems. But the Americans and the Israelis sense this weakness and may well be willing to help them along. I expect a maximum policy of pressure economically from Trump, and I expect espionage and sabotage and assassinations, attacks on critical infrastructure from Israel. And maybe the U.S. and Israel would even consider jointly attacking Iran's nuclear capabilities. So I don't think this is a 1991 moment. I'd be surprised if Iran fell the Islamic Republic in 2025. But I do think that Iran has become the largest risk in the Middle East this year going forward, which it certainly was not last year.
Well, Ian, with Iran, with its back against the wall and in such a difficult situation, what risk is there that it's an even bigger threat because it has nothing to lose?
I think the risk has been that they could mistakenly over-respond to a significant threat. Now, they haven't done that heretofore, Riz. As you know, the Israelis assassinated the political leader of Hamas in Tehran on the date of the Iranian president's inauguration. And one can imagine, if the United States, Trump's elected, he invites Netanyahu to come to his inauguration in Blair House, and the Iranians assassinate him on January 20th, I think the Americans would respond immediately. And Iran didn't. They didn't. They showed incredible restraint. And they showed restraint when they were taking direct missile hits from the Israelis. So, actually, I take your point, Riz, and certainly there are those that recognize that they're in trouble because they look so weak, that their deterrence is no longer effective. But the fact is, there's very little that they can do to effectively threaten Israel and the United States in this environment. They don't have their Axis proxies to do the dirty work for them. They can't even get weapons to Hezbollah anymore because Syria, which was where they were transiting, is gone for them. Israeli air defense is pretty impressive. It's not like Iran is just next door. It's unclear to me what they would do if they had that strategy.
Now, I'm guessing that Vladimir Putin was among those who would not have expected the situation with Ukraine to be going on for so long. We're into 2025 already. And you have number 5 as Russia still rogue. Take us through that.
Well, Russia was number 3 last year. So, the reality is that the Russia risk has gone down somewhat. I do think that the next few months are critical because as we get closer to negotiations, Russia and Ukraine will look to improve their position. And that, it's why Ukraine has now just opened a new offensive inside Kursk in Russia, in Russian territory. We just saw, I think it was 15 Ukrainians killed in Zaporizhia by Russian missile attacks, the largest number of deaths we've had in quite some time in Ukraine from such an attack. Civilians, we're going to see a lot more of that going forward. So that's dangerous. I do believe that, and I mentioned earlier, that a ceasefire is likely to be brokered by the Americans with some support from allies, including Emmanuel Macron. And I think when the new German government comes in, by the way, assuming Friedrich Merz is the chancellor, which is our expectation, that they will be very aligned with Trump and with Macron on this. But even if you get a ceasefire, that is not going to be a breakthrough settlement. And that's the beginning of negotiations, a ceasefire. And that means that sanctions are still on, Russian sovereign assets are still frozen, and there's going to be a lot of conflict between Russia and frontline NATO states. You saw them intervening in the Romanian election. You've seen them pay for acts of arson and vandalism and even attempted assassinations in countries in NATO, in Poland, the Baltics, the Nordics, and the rest. I expect that's going to continue. So I still think that a rogue Russia in alliance with North Korea, with some 10,000 troops on the ground fighting for them and dying for them, I think that this is a pretty dangerous environment.
Now, about 3 decades or so ago, the world got the word Reaganomics when Ronald Reagan was the US president. And you have at number 4, Trumponomics. So take us through that. That's going to be an interesting one this year, isn't it?
Yes, and Trumponomics is really about a Trump administration that is going to implement a lot of what they said they are going to implement. He is in a much stronger position. The Republicans, the GOP, are riding his coattails, not the other way around. He has appointed loyalists inside his administration, not like Republicans who are more loyal to the party his first time around. You don't have people like Mattis and Gary Cohn and Pompeo and Nikki Haley. That's not this group. And that means if he wants to put tariffs in, he's going to put tariffs in. And I think that, there's a Washington Post leak the other day that said, oh, he's going to back off. He immediately posted and said, that's fake news. And I'm setting my tariffs up. We're going to have 100 executive orders to begin with. That's going to have economic implications for the world. That's going to be inflationary. He says he's going to get rid of a bunch of illegal immigrants. I expect him to deport 1 million people in his first year. It's not 15 to 20 million. But, there are going to be labor costs for that. These people are, not only do they work at very cheap rates, but they consume in the United States, and they're taxpayers. Medicare, Social Security, local taxes, that money is going to be gone. And that will also be inflationary. It'll have an impact on growth. Now, there are things that Trump will do that will make the markets happy. So he'll roll back regulations, and he'll extend the 2017 tax cuts on corporates and on high net worth individuals. But I think most of that low-hanging fruit was already picked in his first term. And I also think the macroeconomic indicators are more challenging this time around. The multiples that corporate stocks are trading at of earnings are a lot higher than they were before, less sustainable. You've got, higher interest rates. You've got more challenging debt levels. I just think it is going to be harder for Trump to get the juice in the markets and the growth from this type of politics that he had last time around. So Trumponomics strikes us as a pretty significant risk.
I wonder, Ian, how surprised you were when you heard recent announcements by Donald Trump talking about claims on Greenland, the Panama Canal, that Canada should be part of the USA and so on. These seem to a lot of people to be quite out there.
Yet he talked about the 51st state. He talked about that when he met with the Canadians in his first term. Didn't make as much news then. He's getting more play out of it now. He clearly is leaning into the more extravagant claims on these other countries. When you hear him talk about the Panama Canal and Greenland, he sounds a lot like Putin sounded talking about Ukraine in 2022, justifications for the attacks on Crimea in 2014, the referendum and the illegal annexation. So, not a great thing, but also, we've seen this. When Trump was president first time around, he promised the one thing he said all the time: we're going to build a wall. Mexico's going to pay for it. No one believed that. And Mexico did not pay for a wall. But Mexico did increase security on their own southern border that led to fewer Mexicans and fewer Venezuelans and others coming into the United States. And that was a win for Trump. So what Trump is doing is he's making these crazy demands, and he expects to be appeased. And he's going to be appeased by the Canadians and the Panamanians. And they're not going to give him land, but they're going to do things that are going to make him happier, that he can say, see, I got this done, and Biden couldn't because I'm stronger. So I'm not surprised at all. I think we're going to see a lot more of it, and it's part of the playbook.
And as you mentioned, Russia was in number 3 spot last year. This time it's US-China breakdown. So what are your expectations? Because there's been a lot of rhetoric around the US-China relationship.
Yeah, look, it is possible that we could see a breakthrough deal between Trump and China. He reached out to Xi Jinping and invited him to his inauguration. No American president's ever done that before. Elon Musk is the most powerful person around the administration. And he has never, he says, as you know, he says, has all sorts of horrible things to say about the British government, the German government, the French government. He's never said a bad word about Xi Jinping or about the Chinese dictatorship. So there are people that would like to do a deal. But I don't think the preconditions for a deal are there. I think that American demands around China on technology and on the trade deficit and on Chinese pass-through trade through Mexico, Vietnam, India, into the United States, you're going to see enormous pressure from the U.S. I think you're going to see higher tariffs from the U.S. on China in early weeks in the Trump administration. And I think what the Chinese are willing to do in return is just not enough to get to a deal. They'll buy some soybeans. They'll buy some Boeing planes if Boeing's actually making any. But, you know, I don't think that they're going to get to yes. And absent that, you're going to be moving towards a trade war between the two largest economies in the world. So, you know, that's not a Cold War yet. And it's certainly not a hot war. It's not a fight over Taiwan. But given how big these economies are, that got to number 3 on our list.
Well, at number 2, you have Donald Trump again from Trumponomics earlier on. You've now got the rule of Don. And I wonder where that will fit into 2025.
Yeah. And again, the rule of Don, we're talking about a president that has so much more power in the United States and internationally, and other countries and companies are going to have to respond. Look, we put this report out on January 6th. And I mean, literally within a couple of days of it coming out, we already saw this risk play with Mark Zuckerberg and Meta completely changing their business model to align with Elon and Trump. Now it's community notes and no more moderators and censorship. And instead it's all free speech. And he put a few posts out explaining why he was doing it. And at no point in the post did he say that this is the new model and we should be doing this. Why not just say, I'm doing it because Trump just won and I don't have a choice. It's the rule of Don. You know, I mean, in the law of the jungle, it's a very dangerous place for a lot of people, but it's great to be apex predator. And the rule of Don is what happens to all sorts of other people that need to align with that. And it's a pretty big deal. You know, I mean, you now have Elon Musk, the most powerful member of the private sector in the world, and he paid $250 million for the privilege. He's now regularly on phone calls and in meetings with Trump and foreign leaders and CEOs. Now, I mean, if I looked at Modi and he brought Gautam Adani on a call like that, a meeting like that, we'd be saying, oh my God, this is a banana republic. What are they doing? And yet it's the most powerful country in the world. You can't call the most powerful country in the world a banana republic. What do? You appease it. You get in line. You know, you spend some money on it. You know, you get on to get along. And that is what this means. And especially because Trump was almost assassinated and he believes that his political enemies and the so-called deep state were responsible for putting him in danger. They want to send him in jail. They impeached him twice. He asked for more Secret Service support after they're calling him Hitler and a fascist. They refused. I mean, it's clear that he's going to use the FBI and other agencies to address that. And, you know, if you're an American and you think that this is a guy that could investigate me and my family, you're going to start behaving differently. So I mean, that's why this is risk number 2. And I mean, you know, if you can get Zuckerberg to jump on a dime within a couple of days, there are a lot of people around the world that are a lot weaker positioned than he that are going to do the same.
But Ian, isn't the USA meant to be set up by the founding fathers as having different branches of government that basically provide checks and balances that stop this kind of almost dictatorial power coming into play?
Well, it's not dictatorial power because there are checks and balances. The U.S. is not about to become a dictatorship. In fact, I don't think the U.S. is even on a pathway to becoming Hungary in the near term. And the reason for that is because there's still a professional military. There's still an independent judiciary, no matter who appoints them. And it's still a federal system. Riz, elections in the U.S. are actually run by states. They're not run by the federal government. So Trump doesn't have ability to steal them. And so there are significant limits on what he can do. But, you know, he can absolutely use his power and Elon's money to make life very uncomfortable for folks that don't say how high when he says jump. And that is just as true for Mark Zuckerberg as it is for the Prime Minister of Denmark. So, that's what we're seeing playing out around the world today.
I guess what we're seeing here is the risk of the powerful influence rather than the direct executive power.
That's exactly right.
Well, number one on your list here, Ian, this year is G0, and you wrote G0 wins. So what do you see happening there? I know you've talked about the law of the jungle having come into play.
Yeah, a G0 world is very different from the American-led order that many have discussed over the past decades. I mean, if I think about what the U.S. in principle has stood for since 1989, when the wall came down, it was collective security, it was free trade and architecture that supports it, and it was the promotion of democracy around the world. Now, the U.S. did not do that always consistently. It was frequently hypocritical. A lot of people criticized it. I'm not here to say that America's always right all the time, but that was the model that the United States was attempting to promote, and not only attempting to promote it, Riz, but was telling the Chinese, you need to accept that model for yourself. You're becoming more powerful. We're letting you into the global economy. We're letting you into the WTO, but you're going to have to become more of a democracy. You're going to have to accept rule of law. You're going to have to accept the free market and become responsible stakeholders in U.S.-led multilateral architecture. And not only did China not do that, but it turns out that the United States is actively renouncing that order. It's the first time I've ever seen where a country that creates an order in its image decides that it's no longer interested in that order. And instead, the U.S. is actually taking on a worldview which is much more Chinese. It's much more transactional. It's much more about power. It's not about rule of law. Trump will do a deal with anyone. It can be a dictator. It can be right wing, left wing. It can be a Democrat. He's the guy that sat down with Kim Jong-un. It doesn't matter. But he's going to use his power to get a deal that he wants and that works for the United States. So, as I said, the law of the jungle, the powerful do what they will, and the weak do what they must. That was originally Thucydides, when we had a much less developed geopolitical environment, but it applies increasingly in 2025. And it's a very dangerous place to be if you're not the one that's throwing the punches. So everyone else is playing defense geopolitically, right? I mean, the adversaries of the U.S. are in a weaker position. China's economically, at least for now, but Russia in structural decline, Iran in real trouble, but also the allies. You look at South Korea, Japan, Germany, France, the UK, Canada. These are all countries that are not only in a weak position from a military perspective, from an economic perspective, from a technological perspective, but also their governments are quite weak. So, I mean, Trump's going to get a lot of wins in the early days. He's going to break a lot of furniture.
Well, Ian, it's a great list, and I'm wondering, as we wrap up, what about the red herrings and things that almost made the list, some that didn't, obviously? What you were also looking at over 2025's prospects?
We had a few. One was, despite the fact that the United States is less interested in leaning into climate change and responses to it, we don't think that the global energy transition is going to stall. The Chinese are actually the global leaders right now in transition energy, kind of like the way the U.S. is on AI. And they see that as a huge advantage. They're going to throw an enormous amount of money at it. The Europeans are continuing. India, other countries in the developing world see that they need to for their own benefits. And even in the United States, Texas is the leader in producing renewable energy in the country. Red state Texas has overtaken California in the last couple of years. And so, big pieces of the Biden's Inflation Reduction Act will stay in place to help the energy transition because it's red state jobs. So we don't think that's going to go away. Europe is not going to fall apart as much as Trump might like it to. They've got a strong NATO Secretary General. They've got a strong EU leadership with von der Leyen, with Roberta Metsola, with Kaja Kallas. Macron remains strong on foreign policy, even though his domestic policy has imploded, until at least 2026, when he has to look ahead to his own elections, which are in 27. And Germany, you're leaving a weak chancellor, and instead Friedrich Merz comes in, and he's much more aligned. So we actually think that the EU is going to stay together pretty well, despite all of the anti-establishment, Eurosceptic, and populist winds for change that are coming at the grassroots. And then finally, for all of those people in the U.S. and around the world that think that Trump is incompetent, it's going to fail, we don't. We think that a lot of Trump's efforts, a lot of what Trump's promised to do in his campaign, he's actually going to get done, and he's going to have a lot of wins. He had a lot of wins in his first term. He had USMCA, he had the Abraham Accords. People said he never would have accomplished those things. He's going to have a lot of wins in the first year of his administration as well. Those are red herrings.
Ian, always a real pleasure to speak with you and to pick your brains. Thanks for your insight on what may turn out in 2025.
Riz Khan, great to talk to you, man.
Well, if that list of global risks facing the world has made you want to head back to bed and forget about 2025, let's hear a different perspective from a man who's determined to take on some of those challenges. The former head of the World Trade Organization, Pascal Lamy, refuses to abandon hope. As vice president of the Paris Peace Forum, he's a prominent voice among those promoting a more positive global solution. Pascal Lamy, thank you for the time.
My pleasure.
Let's start with your work with the Paris Peace Forum and look at the challenges, which are quite daunting, from climate change, terrorism, migration, and of course now the challenge of cybersecurity. Where do you start?
Well, what we're trying to do with the Paris Peace Forum, which we created with the French president in 2018, 6 years ago, is to adjust the way we handle international issues to the new realities. To put it very simply, in the old world, states, sovereigns were interacting, treaties, institutions, but they had a sort of monopoly of international relations. This system is not anymore fit for purpose, A, because the capacity to agree is much lower than it used to be because of geopolitical tensions, B, because most of the topics of today, take climate, take cybersecurity, take digital, take drug, take crime, are not just in the hands of sovereigns. Many other stakeholders, large multinationals, NGOs, cities, have an international cooperation capacity, which sometimes is higher than states. So if you want to get things done, you have to try and bring these people to the table with sort of purpose-led coalitions, which may not last 10 or 20 years, but which are better at getting things done.
You used the keyword capacity. From where will the resources come to even start to tackle these?
The good thing about what I call polylateralism as opposed to multilateralism, poly meaning with various actors, is that they bring their own resources. Companies, NGOs, philanthropy have resources which sometimes many states, including the poorer ones, do not have. So they bring resources, they bring expertise, and they bring energy. Their culture is much more often, let's sit around the table, we have a problem, let's try and find a solution together. And the Paris Peace Forum is a sort of incubator of these new coalitions. And incubating is a know-how which we've built and which, not always, but in many cases gives good results on the ground, which we can show do impact the way climate, digitalization, children on internet, or protection of the Southern Ocean can work.
Well, when you were heading the World Trade Organization, WTO, it seemed the world was globalizing. And I wonder to what degree is the promise of a collaborative and increasingly integrated world collapsing into a deglobalization now?
I would not agree with the fact that we've shifted from globalization to deglobalization. I don't think that's the case. We've shifted to a pattern of globalization, to another pattern of globalization, which is different. But if you look, for instance, at the main indicator of globalization, which is the volumes of world trade, they're still growing. So globalization, notably thanks to digital technologies, data transfers, is progressing, but it doesn't happen the same way as before. More regional action, Southeast Asia, the northern continent, Europe and Africa, and of course geopolitical tensions that in some cases are trumping the force of geoeconomics, such as, for instance, more protectionist policies in some sector or by some countries.
That's what I mean. You know, if there is increased trade, it doesn't necessarily happen at a global level. It could be more blocks and more regionalized.
Yes, and that's probably the case for some specific value chain. Okay. If you take the automotive sector, for instance, but it's not going to be the case for shirts or for wheat or for planes. If you look at the composition of international exchange, a lot of that remains really globalized, and many major international companies have a footprint on many continents.
Mr. Lammy, to what degree did COVID play a part in revealing, perhaps, maybe increasing, cracks in the system? What did we learn from that when it came to globalized integrity?
But, I mean, in many ways, COVID was a big test and a big example of globalization. This pandemic, which in Greek means global, was worldwide. Now, the way we have reacted to that, yes, created differences, and at the time, we tried very much, including at the Paris Peace Forum, for instance, to avoid this turning into a new North-South divide. And the reality, retrospectively, is that industrialized countries did not do what they should have done in a globalized world, hence increasing this North-South fracture, which is there on climate, and which will probably be there on digital and cyber if we don't care enough about bridging these divides.
Now, one thing the Paris Peace Forum recognizes is that the world is turning inward. What do you think is a key reason for that?
Well, I think you're right. I've been involved in this international life for the last 35 or 40 years of my life. I've never seen a world in such a bad shape. I've never seen the world in such a mess. And if you look at numbers, the number of armed conflicts, which is one indicator, is the highest since 1945. So this is a reality. We are in a world where geopolitical tension, sovereignty rivalries, starting with US-China, which is the big frame of all this, is moving ahead, and this is bad for development, this is bad for poverty reduction, this is bad for human condition overall, and those of us like me who are a bit of old monkeys have to try and bring a bit of our experience, I would not dare say wisdom, to move the things in a better direction.
What do you think is fueling the populism that is effectively undermining institutions and the well-established mechanisms that were providing at least some collaboration?
I think what's feeding populism is that our economic, social and political systems do not deliver what a large part of our population want. And it's so true that populist parties, populist movements, have been better than others at capturing new trends such as identity politics, negative reactions vis-à-vis migrants, the use of social networks has created clans and polarization. All these elements are together, and I think those of us who are not on that side of politics have to be better at understanding, innovating, and thinking ahead.
That leads me to ask, how has the growth of fake news and now the very convincing deep fake complicated your mission?
Undoubtedly, the proliferation of social networks and of internet has opened a space for negative grouping, for people who feel the same way to coalesce. Some say that's what happened when we started writing. This what happened when we started printing. It may take a few decades before the system adjusts, but clearly for the moment we are not where we should be, and I personally believe that, for instance, total anonymity on social networks is a recipe for trouble.
And even worse, in the days of printing, it still took time to distribute. Now it's all instant and it's global.
Absolutely.
I find the term that the Paris Peace Forum quotes, that peace is not just the suspension of war, is an interesting one at this particular time when we have two major global conflicts. We have the Russia-Ukraine axis, the Israel-Gaza, even wider axis now. What real danger do you believe they pose to the overall world order and stability?
I think, in a way, the conflicts you mentioned are classical power rivalries, like the one we had in the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, the fact that the world, at least for us Europeans, is back to where we were 70 years ago. I mean, Russia invading Ukraine is like Germany invading Poland. It's exactly the same thing. And for roughly the same reasons, something is happening in your neighbor which you want to control, and you send troops. So this is a sort of regression that does not fit with the world of today. And these new power rivalries make it more complex to address the real problems of today, which are not whether I should invade my neighbor or not, but whether we can address climate change, whether we can run a cyber security system, whether we can fight against pandemics, and whether we can educate people. This is the real thing, and this is why at the Paris Peace Forum we try to work on the roots of peace or war, which lie in human systems.
Has it surprised you to see how these conflicts have created a massive disruption in the global supply chains? We've got now flights being cancelled, we see ships stranded, we see a lot of a standstill on the world trade level.
This is absolutely correct, and it shows that whatever digitalization we are moving towards, and there's a lot of that, we still have physical infrastructure, seas, canals, ports, satellites, submarine cables, which are the infrastructures of the world of today and of tomorrow. There still is a physical routing of all this, which is prone to damage, war, and warfare.
Let me wrap up with a brief thought. Do you remain, with all this experience you have and wisdom, whether you like it or not, do you remain optimistic or not?
I remain optimistic with one element, which is science. Science is moving forward incredibly rapidly in many directions, which can and will probably help humanity. This being said, this science, as always, can have a huge benefit, but needs to be controlled, regulated, and if possible, not weaponized.
Pascal, I have many more questions, but next time, I hope. Thank you, sir. Pascal Lamy speaking at the Global Cybersecurity Forum in Riyadh and ending this show with at least some degree of optimism. But that's it for this episode. From me, Riz Khan, and the team, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
The Middle East is going through big changes, from the devastating war in Gaza to shifts in leadership in Syria and Lebanon. At the same time, the re-election of Donald Trump in the United States is reshaping the global politics. I'm Sohaib Sharayer, and I'm pleased to receive Mr. David Lammy, the UK's Foreign Secretary, to discuss the UK's vision and role in all these changes in the region and in the world. Sir David Lammy, thank you for joining us on Al Arabiya TV, and welcome to Riyadh.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with you.
Let's start with your current visit to Saudi Arabia. What's the main purpose of your visit to the kingdom?
Well, the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia have a growing relationship. You know, our trade is up 70%, so it's good to be back in Saudi Arabia. It builds on a visit of our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, to Saudi Arabia just over a month ago, and it consolidates a growing partnership on trade, on defence and security, and a range of people-to-people issues.
Okay, let's move to the Middle East. The situation in Gaza is still intense, Sir David Lammy, and the ceasefire agreement has been delayed. What's the UK's vision to achieve peace in Gaza?
Well, we have been calling for a ceasefire since December of last year. We want to see that ceasefire. We want to see a hostage deal. We want to see the intolerable suffering of the people of Gaza come to an end and a surge in aid. And we are pressing, and I will be going on to Israel to speak to the leadership in Israel to see if we can bridge the gap. We must bring this devastating war to an end.
Is it a big gap now?
Well, I think there has been progress. I think we are close to a deal. And it will be interesting to be in Israel and to speak to the foreign minister and others to see if we can bridge that gap and make that deal happen over the coming days.
Yeah. Foreign Secretary, let's move to Lebanon. With the election of Joseph Aoun as president to Lebanon, how the UK view this development in Lebanon, and what can you do to help the stability in this country?
Well, I've been to Lebanon twice in this last period. It's very important that the ceasefire holds. It's fragile, but I welcome the election of a new president and the stability it will bring to the region. We in the UK have done all we can to support the Lebanese armed forces. We support, of course, this ceasefire. We were the first Western government to call for a ceasefire. Lebanon is a beacon of multiculturalism in the region. Very important in Levant. I will continue to do all I can to support their progress, particularly their economic progress over this next period.
Mr. David Lammy, with the changes in the leadership in Syria after the fall of Bashar al-Assad regime, how do you see the new administration in Damascus?
Well, look, let me begin by thanking Saudi Arabia for convening foreign ministers from across the Arab world, but of course also myself, the High Representative of the EU, my German counterpart and others coming here to Saudi Arabia because it's hugely important that we work together to secure the peace and to secure the opportunity that we now have in Syria. What we want to see is an inclusive government, all minorities respected. Again, this is very fragile indeed. The economy is struggling. there are security issues in Syria at this time. So I'm looking forward to meeting for the first time with the new foreign minister of Syria and looking into his eyes and discussing these really important issues about an inclusive government that really bridges the divides and can move Syria forward. It's in the Middle East interest that Syria is a success, and the people of Syria who've put up with so much deserve nothing less than that.
Mr. Foreign Secretary, will we see you soon in Damascus then?
Well, look, we will judge the new leadership and ATS by their actions, not their words. And therefore, let us see where we get to over the coming months. It's very important that I'm meeting with the Foreign Minister here today in Riyadh.
Excellent. Let's move to the relation between United States and the United Kingdom. With the re-election of Donald Trump, what is the future of the relation between the two countries?
Well, look, I met with Donald Trump back in September. He was a very gracious host, and I want to emphasize that the United Kingdom and the US have a special relationship. It's a relationship built on our close defense cooperation. You know, we have 11,000 troops based in the United Kingdom. It's a relationship built on tremendous intelligence capability. And it doesn't just keep our countries safe, it keeps the global community safe. This is a very tough time with war in Europe and huge challenges here in the Middle East. So for all of those reasons, I'm looking forward to working with the new administration, my counterpart, Senator Rubio particularly, and to bring peace to the world, but it will be peace through strength.
But Mr. David Lammy, what about his comments, criticism of the UK and his statements about Greenland and the Panama Canal and Canada?
If you look behind, I think, the recent statements that he's made about Greenland, the Panama Canal, what he's really getting to is his concerns in the Arctic about Chinese and Russian influence, and actually concerns, I think, about the Chinese in the Panama Canal as well. That's what he's really talking about, and we support and have those similar concerns. Now, with Donald Trump, the rhetoric is always intense, but I think that we understand his modus operandi, we understand that from his first term. And the bottom line is that he came to office wanting to see the economic security of the US people, and we in the UK have come into office, new government, growth is our priority, and also the economic security of the British people, particularly the challenge of migration at this time. So there's a lot of common ground.
Talking about the NATO and the bottom line also, what about the Ukrainian war? What's your vision for this conflict? Donald Trump also said he will end this war when he comes back to the White House.
Well, look, at the moment, we don't see Mr. Putin showing any willingness to negotiate. He's attacking the Ukrainian people with missiles, with drones, their infrastructure, this terrible, aggressive imperialism that we're seeing on the European continent. We are pledged to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We're giving them £3 billion worth of military aid this year and next and the year after for as long as it takes. Of course, we want to see peace, but peace will be brought about by Mr. Putin ending this war, leaving Ukraine, and being serious about a negotiated peace going forward.
Does the UK plan to send more support to Ukrainian?
We will continue to support Ukraine with the military, the economic and the humanitarian support they need.
Mr. David Lammy, we talked about all these wars in Gaza, Lebanon, the change now in Syria. I want to end this interview by asking you, Some think that there is a next war is coming. People think that the next war will be in Yemen or in Iran directly. Are we expecting another war in the region?
Well, look, I don't think war is inevitable in the Middle East. We must do all we can to de-escalate and avoid war. But I would say this, the Houthis particularly and their relentless attacks in the Red Sea is totally unacceptable and must stop. It's destabilizing the region. And Iran's malign behavior and their nuclear ambitions must also stop. These are very, very worrying concerns indeed, but war is not inevitable, and the UK will do all it can to de-escalate at this time.
Foreign Secretary, thank you very much for sharing your insights. We hope the peace will be established here in the region and in the world. Thank you very much for joining us on Al Arabiya TV.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Mr. Geir Pedersen, thank you for giving us Al Arabiya News Channel this interview. So you are here in Riyadh participating the meeting, the ministerial meeting about Syria. What is the most important things you agreed upon today?
Thank you so much. A pleasure being here together with you. It was a very good meeting. It was the second meeting. As you know, we met 3 weeks back in Aqaba, where I think at the time there were lots of questions about what was happening in Syria. We met only 1 week after the collapse of the Assad regime. Now a few more weeks have passed, and obviously within the international community there were more questions. And this time also the caretaker foreign minister of the new Syrian government was also there. So this was an opportunity for him to listen to the international community and for the international community to be listening to what he has to say and the other way around. So I think it was a very good and very important meeting.
So how do you describe the fall of Bashar al-Assad, and did you know that something is cooking?
I think we were all surprised by the speed and how it happened. I had been warning for years that if a real political process didn't start in Syria, we could risk seeing something dramatic happen. And what started on the 27th of November last year and ended on the 8th of December with the collapse of the Assad regime, I think came as a complete surprise to nearly everyone. And I think this also explains a lot of the questions being asked. We have to remember that HTS, which is sort of the dominant force that took power in Damascus, was actually a UN-listed terrorist group. And the fact that this group is now in charge, of course, raised a lot of questions and I think some nervousness, not only among the international community, but also among Syrians. But then very early on, we heard, of course, very positive messaging coming out from al-Shara in particular, where he emphasized that Syria should be for everyone, for all communities, all religious sects, and that it would be inclusive. The new Syria would be for everyone. Then he also said that they needed to take care of the state institutions, that there should be no collapse of state institutions. And then he said that they wanted to give priority to public services, to security, and so on. And I think this was met with relief, first and foremost from the Syrians, but also from the international community. And then I think the question being asked from many Syrians and from the international community was, would this actually be implemented? And I think we have now witnessed a few weeks, and I think we have a clearer picture.
How do you describe today HTC and how you describe also the relation with Ahmad al-Shara?
I think what we have seen is, frankly speaking, a remarkable development. I think today it is 5 weeks since they took power in Damascus. And of course, they don't control the whole of Syria. That's also sort of an important part of this. But I think the fact that we have relative stability in so many areas is extremely important. So I think, while I think many were very nervous that things could start to go wrong very quickly, I think we are now seeing, by and large, that it has been a positive development, but with a few issues. And of course, outside of the big cities, we have seen what I would call a few security incidents. We have seen some attacks on some of the minorities, which I know that the new caretaker authority is also looking into. And then I think we have seen some questions being raised by the fact that now the caretaker government is basically the same government that came from Idlib. But at the same time, and we heard that today here in Riyadh, is that we are getting assurances that after 3 months, plus minus, there will be a new transitional body that will come after we have had a national conference in Syria, and that this transitional body will be inclusive of all, so that no one should be felt excluded in Syria. And I think that is a reassuring message coming out. So to answer your question, I think we see that there is a lot of challenges. Some of these challenges will be with us for months, maybe years to come, but there is an understanding that we can work together on this. We can work together with the caretaker government, hopefully with the transitional body when that is in place, and the international community is ready to come in fully behind and support the Syrian people.
Do you have a time frame about the stage or the transitional period يعني next stage يعني after the 3 months, and what about the dialogue, who's participating?
Listen, this of course is first and foremost the responsibility of the Syrian people. And what we want to see is that what is leading up to what we call the national conference, the national dialogue, whatever we call it, that this is a really inclusive process that sends a message of hope to the Syrian people, that it is credible and that the Syrian people believe it is credible. Of course, we all understand that things in Syria will not immediately be perfect. You know, in this world, nothing is perfect. But what is important is that it is credible and inclusive, so that the Syrian people are willing to come in and to contribute to how it is developing. And then it is, as I said, up to that national conference, or however they want to organize this, to find some kind of an agreement on the next phase. You know, we have heard different things. I think al-Shara said in an interview with you that certain things could take 2 to 3 years. Other things, elections, could take longer, 4 to 5 years. But hopefully these are things that will be discussed by the Syrians themselves. And we are here to hopefully be able to support, to give advice, but again, for the Syrians themselves to decide.
There is 2 core principles in the 2254. First, that should be a political transition in Syria that should be led and owned by the Syrian people. Is that possible? And what about Qassad?
You're absolutely right. You could say there are 2 core principles in Security Council Resolution 2254. It's about that it needs to be a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned transitional process that should lead to a transitional body.
Sure.
That again will lead to a new constitution and free and fair elections. The second and important principle is the protection of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity and independence. So these are the two important things. But the point with Security Council Resolution 2254 was, of course, also that it had language about negotiations between the government and the opposition. And this is obviously no longer relevant. There is no one proposing that we do negotiations with Mr. Assad in Moscow. So that's why we are now working on the possibility to see if we can also make some changes and maybe adopt a new resolution. That is up to the Security Council to decide, but I think it would be a good way to to move forward, to tell also the Syrian people that the Security Council and the international community understand that there is a new beginning and that we are willing to work with the Syrian people based on the core principles of that resolution, but that we see that something new is happening. Then on the situation in the northeast, obviously this is a major challenge, and it is extremely important that we find a political solution to this. And I was pleased to hear that there had been a meeting between the SDF and the HTS in Damascus. I understand there is no agreement yet, but hopefully we will give it time so that it could develop into a political solution. That means that all of Syria is now united behind the possibility of have a new beginning for all Syrians, all communities.
So the second core principle, you talk about it, the protecting the sovereignty and independency on the safety of the Syria lands. Okay, so if this principle is still alive and we are seeing the daily Israeli incursions into the Syrian lands?
I'm afraid you're absolutely right that we are seeing a daily violation from the Israeli government against Syria. And I've said many times, and I can repeat it now, this needs to stop. The violation of Syria's sovereignty, the invasion, the occupation of new land is in violation of international law and the principle that the UN is based on. It's not only that, but it is also happening at a time when we have what I would call a critical transitional process in Syria. And instead of complicating that, all neighbors should show a positive interest in seeing that we have stability and a new beginning for Syria. So this is a huge responsibility also on the Israeli side.
If Mr. al-Shara do what they are saying, that want an inclusive process with all the parties in Syria, then you believe it's the right time to remove the sanction, and what are the guarantees we'll ask for?
No, I think this is a very important question. And yes, I really do believe that if we now see a truly inclusive political transitional process that leads to an inclusive transitional body, and with the process leading to a new constitution and a new elections, hopefully, then yes, there is, I think, a deep willingness from the international community to come in and to help. And at least I can promise I will do then my utmost to make sure that sanctions will be lifted. Because we know very well that if sanctions is not lifted, it will not really be possible to rebuild Syria. So we need to see two things, that the transitional process is moving forward and that the international community respond to that. But I can tell you, after listening to my colleagues from the international community here today, I'm confident that this should be possible to achieve. I'm not saying that it will be, an uncomplicated process. There are always hiccups in processes like this. But we need to be very clear on this, that this is absolutely necessary to be able to see that we start to see the rebuilding of Syria, that will end the poverty that so many are now living in. We have now close to 17 million people in Syria in need of humanitarian assistance. And as you know, we want Syrian refugees to be able to return. We have now maybe had 500,000 since the 400,000 came from Lebanon. We have a little bit more than 100,000 after the 8th of December. So more than 500,000 people coming in, all of them needing, humanitarian assistance. But we need to make sure it's sustainable. And that can only happen if we are really rebuilding Syria. And that needs a lot of international support, new businesses, and the end of sanctions.
The Guardian newspaper published a report about a few days ago about the next stage of Syria, and you are supporting a democratic transition, but you are facing resistance from within the country because because the UN is unpopular and there is no trust about the UN. Because also the UN let down the Syrians. How do you respond to this talk, and how do you reassure the Syrians?
I think we have to be honest and to say that we all let the Syrian people down during the 14 years or close to 14 years of war and conflict. We were not able to really live up to the expectations of the Syrian people when it comes to nearly everything. And after the collapse of the Assad regime, we have now seen all the brutality that that regime brought through. So it's understandable that there is a lot of anger against the international community. And I would say it was an international, I think, a collective failure. And of course, the UN is part of that. And for many, we are the face of that. And there is only one way out of that, and that is to start to rebuild trust. And the way we can do that is to say that we are here now to serve the Syrian people, hopefully in close coordination and cooperation with first the caretaker authority and then with the new transitional body. And as I said, I think the international community is united now behind a willingness to come behind and to support the new Syria. And why is that? Because I think no one can afford that Syria do not succeed. The Syrians can't afford it, and the international community can't afford it. So here there is a joint interest in trying to move forward.
So the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with its regional and international influence, how do you describe its role in establishing the new Syria?
I think the fact that we met in Riyadh today at the initiative of the Kingdom, I think says a lot. I think it re-emphasizes what I have emphasized already, that there is a willingness from Syria's neighbors, from the Gulf states, and from the broader Arab region to make sure that Syria succeeds. And I think the message from Saudi Arabia today was that they want to be at the forefront of that process. And I think that is welcome by everyone to see this. And in my discussions today with the Saudi authorities, I think we agreed that there is a huge potential, there are many challenges, and that we can only solve it if we work together. We work with the Syrians, and we work together as an international community.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, no end in sight to the massive wildfires in Los Angeles County, now known to have claimed the lives of at least 24 people. Investigators, meanwhile, say they're trying to determine what sparked those blazes. Reports emerge of a breakthrough in the talks in Doha between Israel and Hamas. The outgoing US President Joe Biden says he wants a ceasefire in Gaza before he leaves office next Monday. Plus, we're going to be getting reaction to our interview with Donald Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton. In particular, we'll be examining the president-elect's claims on Greenland and the Panama Canal, plus his refusal to rule out using military force to take control of both territories. Hello and welcome to the programme. We're going to begin in California, where investigators are trying to determine what caused a series of massive wildfires which have resulted in the deaths of at least 24 people. Well, thousands of homes and businesses have also been destroyed in the Los Angeles area. Well, lightning, which is the most common cause of fires in the United States, has been ruled out as the cause for the Palisades and Eaton fires. Well, local authorities say they're examining all possible theories, which include arson and faulty electricity cables. But what is clear is that high temperatures, extended drought and strong winds have created the perfect conditions for these kinds of wildfire. Well, there's a growing sense of frustration, especially amongst those who are desperate to return to their homes, as they had little time to pack up during the evacuation process. Well, for others, they don't even know if they have a home to go back to.
I want to collect my dad's ashes, which we had to leave behind, as well as my grandma's ashes, which we also had to leave behind. We were evacuating horses from the ranch where my mom teaches horseback riding. So we were there once the fire started. We were there all day, and we had no chance to go home.
I got here at 6 a.m. It's 11:30, and then they're not letting people in. So what people are doing is they're parking their car and coming back on the street another day. It's gotten exponentially harder to get in. Rightfully so, because of the looting. I did get in 2 days ago when the market burned down, and I had to turn around because the smoke and the visibility, and it's like you were in a ball of fire, and I turned around for my own safety.
The knee-jerk is to be frustrated, but the truth is that anybody who understands even the slightest bit about fires knows that all it needs is a good wind, and things can turn bad quickly. So I know they're doing that for everyone's safety. It doesn't make us want our belongings out of there any less, especially the cars with gas and things like that. But, you know, there's sentimental value to a lot of the things up there.
Well, Hollywood has united to help victims of the wildfires. The actress Halle Berry has donated her entire closet. Jamie Lee Curtis is pledging to donate $1 million US. Paris Hilton, whose home was destroyed by the Palisades fire, has also donated money. So too has Beyoncé, who's pledging $2.5 million US through her Be Good non-profit organization. Well, for more, we can speak now to Sean Mandel, the entertainment reporter for the New York Post, who joins us from Los Angeles. Thank you so much for joining us, Sean. If you could just start off by telling us what's going on around you.
Absolutely. It's been a very dramatic weekend, as you might imagine. There has been some good news for firefighters in Los Angeles after fires on Friday and Saturday first started to get worse, continued to get worse despite increased efforts that were being made, particularly with regards to airdrops of water and fire retardants that hadn't been able to happen at first when the fires broke out because of these hurricane-force winds. Now, those winds are threatening to kick back up again this week for the next 2 days, actually, starting today. But thankfully, they died down enough over the weekend that fires that were threatening more communities, particularly a neighborhood known as Brentwood, another one, Encino, both of which are suburban communities, but also have large contingent of celebrities who live there. Those have been spared for the moment now, which is definitely good news for all of LA. But now the question comes, what is the rest of the week going to look like?
Yeah, and clearly, as you mentioned, homes of lots of people, including celebrities, destroyed. A lot of heartbreak for a lot of people. I'm just wondering, as a reporter, what sort of stories have you been covering the last week or so?
It's been a really harrowing number of stories, type of stories that have been coming onto my radar, and just seeing and hearing, you know, not just as a reporter, but as a person who's lived in Southern California for the vast majority of his life. So it's everything from hearing tales of people's schools being burned down, you know, teachers in the middle of the night finding out that they don't have a classroom to return to in the morning, to as well, you know, hearing the way that this has affected, even though one of the major fires here, of course, affected the Pacific Palisades, which is, as you mentioned and alluded to, also the area of Malibu, a celebrity enclave. There are tons of affluent and high-profile people who live there, and yet the fires don't discriminate in terms of who the victims were. Jennifer Garner had a very heart-wrenching story to tell about as she was spotted out giving donations and working with Chef Jose Andres' World Central Kitchen to bring food to people who are victims of the fire who've been evacuated. A friend of hers, she said, didn't make it out in time from the fire. And that is just a horrific image, you know, a horrific thing to have to imagine. And the death toll is continuing to rise. You know, at first we didn't have a large, obviously any loss of life is tragic, but the numbers were not particularly high at first that we got from local authorities, which you might expect for something as disastrous as this is. It's 35,000 plus acres have been burned. But what we do know now is that the death toll is at least at 24 as of Monday morning here in LA, and that number is expected to rise. And as I said, it has affected everyone from celebrities to everyone else in the area. You know, there are people such as, Paris Hilton, who did lose, her beach home, for instance, as well as a number of other individuals. But at the same time, you have people who've been here for 50, 60 years in these communities when were not what they are sort of considered to be today. So it's just crossed a broad swath of society and of LA.
Yeah, indeed. And just looking, I mean, at the entertainment industry more broadly, I mean, you mentioned some of the celebrities, and, on our list, we're being told Mel Gibson, Billy Crystal, Anthony Hopkins, Jeff Bridges, some of the people who've lost their homes in addition to the ones you mentioned. And some people watching might say, okay, well, they'll probably be all right financially. But they also are just really, aren't they, the tip of an iceberg in a whole ecosystem of people involved in the entertainment industry. It includes people like makeup artists and security staff. I mean, thousands of lives have been seriously affected, haven't they?
Absolutely. I mean, it is an industry town. We have to think of it. I think it's a foremost thing to be in our mind, is that it does trickle down to every other person who is involved in the entertainment industry. You have, this is going to halt work on things. And that seems bizarre to maybe, think about it in that way, but that is the economy of Los Angeles. And that has ripple effects that will go out, because there are going to be people who are unable to work on projects because of this. There are going to be people who now will be having to focus on other things, and rightfully so. But as you mentioned, it isn't just the celebrities. It is these people who, what we would call below the line, or people, that many might consider behind the scenes. But those are people who really are the lifeblood of Los Angeles, because that is the majority of the entertainment industry. We think of these celebrities as these A-listers, these top lights, names in shining lights, but they are not, they are a select few. And now as well, considering the way that property values, for instance, in Los Angeles have changed over the decades, a lot of these people who have been working steadily in the entertainment industry are successful, established, as you said, whether it's hair, makeup artists, grips, directors of cinematography, long list of different roles that these individuals could have. They today wouldn't be able to afford the neighborhood that they have now lost their home in. And that is going to present a large number of problems, as well as the fight to deal with insurance and insurance claims only begins. And where are they going to live in the meantime, and how are they going to be able to get back to the work they need to do and they want to do?
Yeah, and Sean, as we've been talking, we've been looking at images of the fires. I mean, extraordinary. And those images themselves, ironically enough, look like they come out of a Hollywood disaster film. We're talking here about the value of this industry to the state. I'm told that the industry is worth about 115 billion US dollars, the entertainment sector, for the economy of California. But we're talking, aren't we, about an industry that long before these fires started, was an industry in quite a lot of difficulty, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it has been a watershed moment for the entertainment industry in so many different ways. Because on one hand, you have the change of technology. Ever since 2008, where streaming services really, and the web, as it was alluded to and called then, began changing the way that what is now termed content is made, that has been a big enough shift in and of itself in terms of figuring out how to make TV, how to make film, how to make it profitable. You add on top of that the dual actors and writers strikes that just ended within the past 12 months or so. That has also been, as much as every people in the guilds in Los Angeles, actors and writers and other union members and other people in the creative arts have been supportive of those strikes and are happy that with the gains that were made, the entertainment industry has not gone back to pre-strike levels in terms of the amount of work being put out. Now, that is then even made worse by the COVID pandemic, which also dramatically altered the landscape of film and television and streaming, and that cut back work before you even had the strikes. And to make it an even more challenging time, you have the issue of the future of movies. You know, cinema and TV, there's been a big question about where do movies go from here, in the sense that it is still a profit. Movies themselves are still profitable, but people are going to the movies less and less. And that with declining box office numbers around the globe and even in the US, that is an economic question mark that has been left there. And we have, of course, social media, which is unlike anything we've seen before in the era of social media, in that you have, for example, content creators, and they have their own economy that is threatening what Hollywood is putting out.
All right, sure. Just very briefly, lastly, I know you present a royal podcast called Spilling the Royal Tea. I read you've also penned an article about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle meeting victims in LA. I mean, are they affected, those two?
They are not so far in the fire evacuation zones. They are, or anything in that immediate sense. They live north, about 90 miles north of Los Angeles, in Santa Barbara, in an area of Santa Barbara called Montecito. Meghan, however, is from Los Angeles. She is from a part of town known as Los Feliz, which is a little bit west of one of the fire areas. A lot of their friends, reportedly, we're told, are staying with them, who have lost homes and who have fled these evacuations. So in a sense, they have not been directly impacted by the fires, though there are these high wind warnings that are back this week, and their area is under, where they live, is under that warning.
Okay, Sean Mandel, really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, let's get more analysis. We can speak now to John Valiant, the author of Fire Weather, a true story from a hotter world. John joins us from Orange County, California. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. You wrote an article that was published in The Guardian on Saturday, and in it you paint a picture of what sounds pretty apocalyptic, complete with blizzards of flying embers, you describe them as. You say this is part of a much larger planetary event. Can you explain for us what you mean by that?
Yeah, over the past 250 years, as we've increased our dependence on fossil fuels, starting with coal and then moving into oil and gas, we've supercharged the atmosphere with CO2 and methane. And what we're seeing, especially over the past decade, 2 decades, is an intensification not only of earthly temperature, which I know you're really feeling in Dubai and environments, but also in fire behavior globally. So this bona fide firestorm that took over large portions of Los Angeles County a couple of days ago, and which continues to this day through this week, was replicated in Valparaiso, Chile last spring. Texas had the biggest fire in its history this past March. Lahaina, Hawaii, burnt to the ground, killing 100 people last year or 2 years ago. The same thing happened, alas, in Fort McMurray, Alberta, in the subarctic of Canada in 2016. Australia burned apocalyptically in 2019, 2020. So this is unfortunately one more flare-up rather than an isolated event.
Yeah, but we've been told on this channel, speaking to other experts like you, that wildfires are a natural and vital part of the environment's life cycle, and therefore it's not purely the result of human activity. Doesn't it mean that these fires were inevitable and would have happened regardless of what human beings did?
So, Tom, this is a really important question you're asking. And what climate change does is it amplifies natural systems, natural behavior. We all know that Southern California is wildfire prone. It's a natural part of the environment here. There are seasonal winds, seasonal fires. That's all fine and normal. What is not fine is the fact that Los Angeles had the hottest summer in its history this past summer, and followed by 8 months of drought. So now what you have is a kind of supercharged fire scenario. And that's what climate change does is, in the case of Hurricane Helene, which trashed the southeastern United States, hurricanes are normal. They've always been there, but they have not dropped a meter of rain in the mountains of North Carolina ever in history. And that's what we're seeing are these historic extremes that are driven by our dependence on fossil fuels.
Yeah, there seems to be a lethal combination of factors at work here. I mean, there's no rain forecast for the weeks ahead. There hasn't been any rain for quite some time there. You've got thousands of kilometres of extremely arid landscape, gusting winds thrown into the mix as well. Doesn't all of this sound like, you've got a lot of human beings living in a place where, in fact, they perhaps shouldn't be living at all?
Well, I mean, here's the thing, Tom. So Los Angeles County is the most populous county in the United States. It's been heavily populated for 50, 75 years. Fires have been a feature of that landscape. But in Pacific Palisades, the community that burnt so totally and tragically a couple of days ago, some of those buildings were 100 years old. So that tells you that either they've just been lucky for 100 years or that the fires simply were not as intense. And if you talk to any firefighter who went through that, any long-term resident, they will all say, I've never seen anything like this. And I spoke, when I was researching fire weather, I spoke to CAL FIRE veterans, and that's the statewide fire service, one of the oldest and biggest it's the oldest and biggest fire service in the United States. And these were veterans who'd been on the force for 25 years, and they were describing the Redding fire tornado of 2018. This was an EF3 tornado generated by wildfire, and none of them had seen anything remotely like that. And it was, 38 degrees at 6 p.m. The night that tornado that emerged out of the flames and destroyed a significant part of Redding, California. So, this is new. And so what it's saying, though, is that we need to rethink where we live. We need to rethink how we build. But above and beyond all of that, we need to rethink how we power our civilization.
Indeed. And it sounds to me as though you're saying this is the face of things to come. We're going to have more and more of these types of phenomenon.
If we don't decarbonize, absolutely. And a certain amount of this misery is already baked in. But the sooner we transition away from climate-changing fossil fuels, the sooner we can start to restore some semblance of balance. We are in a world out of balance right now. And I know Dubai is almost a poster child for that. It's intolerably hot in the summer. It's almost lethally hot in the summer. And without air conditioning, that city would not function. Could not exist.
There's this massive investigation underway in California to get to the bottom of what triggered those fires in the first place. Lightning apparently is the most common source of a trigger of wildfires. That's been ruled out. I mean, what looks to you like the likeliest cause?
So Tom, you got almost, I think, about 9 million people in the Los Angeles County area. And we engage with fire in all kinds of ways that we don't even think about. Our cars are filled with explosions as they power us down the road. Our mufflers on ATVs, motorcycles, and cars can get fire hot. Sparks are thrown by tools. Sparks can be thrown by static electricity. It is so dry in the hills around even where I am in Orange County, south of LA, that you could drop a match and get a fire going. You could drop a cigarette and get a fire going. There are claims of arson. That can't be ruled out. That's a possibility. But arson doesn't drive catastrophic fires any more than a dropped cigarette does. There are many, many fire sources amongst 9 million people, and it could have been any number of things, and it's probably a combination, of the above.
And in terms of how the fires have been managed, we've heard a lot from the President-elect Donald Trump, who on his Truth Social platform has been pointing the finger at local officials in California, accusing them of incompetence. He said, quote, "They just can't put out the fires. What's wrong with them?" Do you think it's realistic to think that people, these fires can be put out, given the scale that they're on? Or is this just nature taking its course, and is nature going to prove to be stronger than any effort to try and douse those flames?
Well, first of all, for the future leader of the country to be scoring political points off a lethal tragedy in the most populous state and the most populous city in the union is reprehensible. And as far as being able to put the fires out, the aerial crews now working on this fire, helicopter and airplane, are the best in the world. But they cannot fly when it's blowing 130 kilometers an hour. You simply can't operate safely that way. That's what was happening when the fires ignited. Since then, they have been building perimeters of fire retardant and fire breaks around the fire. They've contained a lot of it. That could all come undone tonight, though, because more Santa Ana winds are predicted to blow, 100 kilometers an hour, and that drives embers. And those ember barrages that we spoke of at the top are what really set cities on fire, because they will fly over any fire break, and when it's this dry, they'll ignite off almost anything that's flammable. And so this is going to be a very hairy 24 hours.
Yeah, and of course those embers can travel very large distances. Just lastly, I mean, these reports of fire hydrants and reservoirs running dry, I don't know what you make of those reports, but does it sort of paint a picture of a scenario that could have, this could have been much less serious than it has turned out to be? Could more have been done?
So, Tom, when it's blowing 120K, water won't even work on a fire like that. And, fire weather, I kind of unpacked how unstoppable these fires are. I call it 21st century fire. And when it's burning with this kind of energy, these fires are effectively unfightable. You have to wait until the weather changes. But there's, as far as these fire hydrants, when you live on hilltops, as people in California do, and as people in Fort McMurray do, the fire I described in fire weather, you have to pump water to get up there. But if all the houses are on fire and you have huge fire crews up there pumping water into the fire, you are going to tax those pumps and tax those reservoirs in an unnatural way. The other thing that people don't think about, and that this is a really important detail, when you burn 1,000 houses, it doesn't turn the water off. All those water mains that run into each one of those houses is still running at full blast. And that will drain a reservoir or max out a pump or dry a hydrant very, very quickly. And so I'm not saying there aren't problems with Los Angeles infrastructure. Every big older city has problems. But this was a catastrophic event.
OK, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. John Valiant, thanks again.
Thanks, Tom.
Now, there are reports that there's been a breakthrough in the ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas. Well, in what is his final week in office, the US President Joe Biden has spoken with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu by telephone. And in their conversation, Biden is understood to have stressed the immediate need for a ceasefire there in Gaza before he leaves office next Monday. Well, mediators Qatar have handed Israel and Hamas what's described as a final draft of a ceasefire and hostage release agreement designed to pause the fighting, which, according to the health authorities in Gaza, has claimed the lives of more than 46,500 people. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Mick Mulroy, the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East during the first Trump administration. Thank you very much for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. How encouraged are you by these reports of a breakthrough in the talks in Doha?
Well, good to be with you and your audience. I would hope everybody would like to see a ceasefire in Gaza. So I want to be encouraged. Of course, I think there's fair reason to be somewhat skeptical because we've seen in the past an over-optimism when it comes to these agreements being close to the finish line when they then fall apart. But I do think because Hamas is isolated, very isolated now with essentially the defeat of Hezbollah, the ejection of Iran out of Syria, and the incoming Trump administration, which is really putting pressure on Israel to come up with an agreement before he takes office on January 20th. I think all the factors would lead to this being the most optimistic time that we could get to an agreement.
OK, so for those who are watching and who are thinking to themselves, this notion that a deal is closer than ever, for them, that it feels like a real déjà vu. We've heard this on countless occasions during the last 15 months. You're saying that something is new and that there is cause for some optimism at this stage.
Yes, I think that's fair. And I think we're seeing both the current administration in the United States, Biden administration, and the incoming Trump administration working together, essentially putting pressure on Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu specifically, to come to an agreement. He, of course, has political issues. He's concerned that the far right of his coalition may pull out, but he's also concerned that he wants to start on a good foot with incoming President Trump, who's made it clear that he wants to see an agreement before he takes office. So I think there are factors that are different than the past. Skepticism is still, I think, a fair thing to have. But I would hope that with all the pressure right now on Israel and Hamas, of course, to have a ceasefire, that we could get one before 20 January. So this week, in some time, we could see an agreement that could see over 30 hostages released and a substantial increase in humanitarian aid into Gaza, which is sorely needed.
Yeah, because the 20th of January, obviously Inauguration Day, as we've been saying, does feel like it's become a bit of a de facto deadline for some sort of a result from these talks. Let's just be clear, and you did mention that, but I just want to emphasize this really for the benefit of our viewers. We're talking here, aren't we, about a pause in the fighting and not a complete end to the war, aren't we?
That is true. It's in a phased manner. So the first phase would see a specified agreed upon amount of hostages come out. It's not the full amount. It's primarily women and elderly, non-IDF soldiers, for then a certain amount of Palestinian prisoners to be released. It would also have the Israelis move out of some of the population centers, but not out of Gaza. And of course, it would have a specified number of trucks that would be delivered into Gaza for humanitarian aid. And that would be in the first phase. If that works, then they would negotiate to go into the second phase, which is more prisoners, more of the IDF presence out of population centers, all the way to, as you said, a permanent ceasefire if they get to the final phase. But this is just to get into a pause and into the first phase.
OK, and in terms of who's involved in the talks, and you've alluded to this as well, there are members of the incoming Trump administration who are present at the table, and that's obviously important for continuity's sake. But what sort of a difference do you think a new US Secretary of State is going to make to the situation? I mean, what does he bring to the table?
Well, of course, it's presumed, or the designee is Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida who sits on a lot of the key committees in the Senate. And he is very well knowledgeable, being in Foreign Affairs and in the Intelligence Committee, and I believe the Armed Services Committee, in all the aspects that would be necessary being the Secretary of State. So I think he's going to have somewhat of a smooth transition, certainly compared to some of the other nominees by President Trump who haven't had that much experience, as Senator Rubio. And of course, he's coming in with the clout of President Trump behind him. And when it comes to Israel, the relationship in the past, the first administration, was very good. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu would like to see that continue. So he's going to, I think, be somewhat deferential, maybe even more so than President Biden to President Trump. But I do think the policy, although there might be some differences, will be somewhat consistent. And it usually is when it comes to foreign policy between administrations, even between parties in the United States. But of course, we in the media tend to highlight the differences. But I do think there'll be a fairly consistent policy when it comes to U.S. relationships with Israel and our efforts against Iran.
Okay, and of course, some of the old sticking points have continued to be very much present in those negotiations. But do you think there has been compromise on both sides? And do you think that's going to help perhaps eliminate some of those old sticking points?
Yes, and any negotiations essentially mean compromise on both sides. If neither side's compromising, that's really not a negotiation. It's forced on the other side. And I do think, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu has to balance his obvious country. Its country has different political sides. It's a democracy, just like the United States. He has to balance both sides. But in order to get these hostages back, he's going to have to concede on some of the issues. And Hamas, if they seemingly care at all about the people of Gaza, I would argue that their actions indicate they don't. But if they do, then they're going to have to concede on some aspects of what they don't want to agree to in order to get to a ceasefire, to really stop the fighting, of course, and bring in more humanitarian aid and eventually get to a path of reconstruction and some kind of diplomatic path forward. So it's incumbent on both sides, I think, to concede on some of these sticking points, if you will, and get to a ceasefire negotiation. And I think all parties that have influence on either side should use that in a positive way to get both sides there.
Yeah, and there are splits on both sides, aren't there? Because there are Hamas officials inside Gaza who see things in one way, those who are outside who see things in another. And then, of course, in Israel, splits within the government, notably these far-right elements that oppose really any deal. I'm just wondering how much of an obstacle you think the far-right could ultimately be to not just this round of talks, but the talks going forward that bring about some sort of a more permanent settlement.
Well, they certainly proved to be very influential. And I think that has been some of the reasons why in the past, even though there was a lot of expressed optimism, we didn't actually get to an agreement. The far-right coalition, Smotrich, for example, if they should leave the coalition, it could bring down Prime Minister Netanyahu's government. So I think they have a lot of influence. But ultimately, it's Prime Minister Netanyahu who is responsible to the people. It's responsible for both the hostages, recovery, rescue, and of course, the ending the war. I mean, this has had a huge tax on the population of Israel, who relies very heavily, for example, on reservists to fight the wars both in Gaza and in southern Lebanon. So ultimately, the buck stops with him. But I think from his perspective, he wouldn't be in that position if the right leaves him. So they have a lot of influence. Undoubtedly, and hopefully they can see that Prime Minister Netanyahu has to lead the nation, not just any particular party, and it's in the nation's interest to have a ceasefire to recover their hostages, of which, of course, should never have been taken in the first place, and in the fighting, which is caused a great tax on the Israeli people and their economy.
Yeah, so you're saying that basically the risk of his coalition splintering as a result of differences of opinion on how to bring about a pause or a more permanent ceasefire are one of the risks. There's also this other risk, and we've had analysts on this program who've said that when the fighting stops, some of Benjamin Netanyahu's legal woes might start to catch up with him. Do you think that's a factor that's present in his mind with regards to bringing about an end to this war?
So, of course, I can't read his mind, but I would agree with your other analysts. It certainly could be a factor. If he's no longer the prime minister, then the legal issues that he had going that were paused essentially could happen. And if he's no longer in this conflict, then of course we're going to get to a point where people are going to assess fully everything that happened that led to this successful terrorist attack on October 7th, and of course whether he should be held responsible for any of that happening, and then potentially pick a new prime minister. And if that is the case, and he's no longer the prime minister, then it's assumed that the legal issues he had before would resume, and he could face the consequences of those. So I think both of those could be, just looking at it as an analyst, could be a factor in how he views the war going forward. And more important than what I think there's Israelis that think that there is a political interest in Prime Minister Netanyahu continuing this fight to remain in office. And that, of course, could be substantial when it comes to when they choose a new prime minister.
And obviously central to the negotiations, and a lot of the domestic pressure will revolve around this as well for Prime Minister Netanyahu, are the 251 people who were taken hostage, 94 of whom still held in Gaza, 34 of whom the Israeli authorities believe to be dead. I mean, what do we know about the 60 remaining presumed to be living hostages? Are there any examples, any evidence of that they're still alive?
So that's been one of the biggest sticking points in these negotiations. Even in negotiations to recover one hostage, there's usually what's called a proof of life that starts the whole negotiations, because you don't know what you're negotiating for if the individual is in fact dead. That hasn't happened in this case, and that's one of the reasons why Israel keeps hemming when it comes to going into the first phase of this ceasefire agreement, because they don't know how many are actually alive. Hamas has been saying they don't know because they would have to be able to freely move around Gaza to go to these locations to provide this proof of life, and they can't do that when the fighting's still continuing. But certainly this is an issue that is really a main factor in these negotiations. We don't know, we collectively don't know, and it's important to point out that up to 7 Americans are still being held hostage. So America, the United States, is not just a mediator in this. We are an aggrieved party, and we have the responsibilities to recover our citizens completely, not just to help with the negotiations. So those are all factors in this, and that's one of the things that people think President Trump's talking about when he used the phrase they'll be held to pay, is he's talking about the U.S. effort to recover our own citizens. I don't know that to be true, but that's certainly one of the potentials for what he is talking about, that we take a more active military role in the recovery of those hostages. But either way, this proof of life or lack thereof has been substantial when it comes to these negotiations not actually coming to an agreement.
Okay, and just lastly, when do you expect us to hear what? What's your hunch with regards to these talks, which we understand are in a very advanced stage in Doha?
I do think it'll come this week, potentially before the 17th. Is from what I've been hearing from fellow analysts and people I know that are either directly involved in negotiations or are aware of them. But I think the date really is the 20th. If doesn't happen on the 20th, I wouldn't give up hope, of course, and negotiations should continue. I just think that is a significant milestone that if Hamas is paying attention to, they probably would want to have an agreement before then, or this could restart the negotiations from zero, actually.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Mick Mulroy, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Moving on now, in an exclusive interview on this channel, Al Arabiya News, we spoke to John Bolton. He is, of course, the former US ambassador to the UN and the former national security advisor under Donald Trump. We spoke about President-elect Trump's recent remarks and his interest in taking control of Greenland and the Panama Canal. Well, Donald Trump has refused to rule out military action to take control of Greenland or the Panama Canal. Let's take a listen to what the former ambassador, John Bolton, had to say. I started off by asking him about Trump's interest in Greenland and the possibility that the US could take control of the territory that belongs to Denmark.
Well, let me say first, there is zero chance that the United States is going to use force to do that. And the way Trump approaches issues like this, especially in such a public fashion, leads people, unfortunately, to think that the whole idea is kind of bizarre. Let me just say, I looked at this question very carefully in 2019 when it first arose, when I was National Security Advisor, and the United States has long had significant security interest in Greenland. We go back to World War II, just as one example. Franklin Roosevelt put American military forces on Greenland at the invitation of the local government before Pearl Harbor, after the Danish government fell to the Nazis. Because of the importance of the North Atlantic convoys. In the Cold War, it was quite important. So there's a long history here. And how to resolve the current threats in the Arctic from Russia and China, especially as global warming results in more maritime passages through the Arctic Ocean, is serious not just for the United States, but for Canada and the entire NATO alliance. I think there are ways that we can have quiet conversations with Denmark and the home rule government in Greenland. I don't think it's appropriate to negotiate this in a football stadium under spotlights. And I think that quiet diplomacy is the way to go here, because I do think this serious issue needs serious consideration.
Okay, so it sounds like you don't entirely agree with the means, but do you agree with the end goal, which is, did you conclude in 2019 that, yes, indeed, the United States should acquire Greenland?
Well, we didn't get to that point because Trump blew the negotiations up. We hadn't even really started by talking about it publicly and putting the government of Denmark, democratically elected government of Denmark, in an impossible political position. This is not how you negotiate with friends and allies. It's one thing to send a signal to the Chinese and the Russians, but you don't put friends in a corner up against the wall. Look, I'd be satisfied ultimately with full American sovereignty over Greenland. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think it's important, as my former boss, Jim Baker, used to tell me all the time, keep your eyes on the prize. The prize here is security for the United States and its treaty allies, including Denmark. It's not necessarily sovereignty. We have an existing bilateral treaty with Denmark, the Defense of Greenland Treaty from 1951, that could be a vehicle. I think there are many possibilities here, but it's a sensitive subject, as people I'm sure can understand, and the way you deal with subjects like that is privately.
Okay, another sensitive subject, the Panama Canal. What do you make of what Donald Trump's been saying about that?
Well, again, there's not going to be any force used against the Panama Canal. It's so typically the case. Trump takes an issue where there's a grain of importance in what he's saying, and you lose sight of the real focus because of his bizarre approach. Panama Canal is vital for American national and economic security, and really for world trade and economic prosperity in troubled times. I think many Americans, many people around the world, are concerned by the Chinese effort to gain control of sensitive port facilities and sensitive maritime locations like the operation of the Panama Canal. I do think there are issues with what China is up to, and I do think that it's legitimate for the United States and others who depend on the canal to raise this with the Panamanian government. That's what we should do, again, privately, quietly. And just make sure that Chinese operators, Chinese involvement, which should be minimal to begin with, does not pose a threat.
Former U.S. ambassador to Panama, who you may know, John Feely, told US media that taking back the Panama Canal would require a war. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, it would require steps the United States is not going to take. This is Trump blowing steam and trying to confuse people. His supporters say this is good negotiation technique. I think it's bad negotiation technique. You don't put the government of Panama in this kind of trouble. Look, last week, the president of Panama said he wanted to work with the United States to cut off the flow of illegal immigration from South America, people walking through Panama to get to the Rio Grande border between the U.S. and Mexico. He said that America's natural border is the Darien Gap. And for Donald Trump, who thinks illegal immigration is one of his biggest priorities, this is a statement, really remarkable statement by the president of Panama that showed a willingness to work with us to address the problem of illegal immigration. I hope Trump hasn't blown that up as well. It's one thing to be the center of attention, which Donald Trump always likes to be. It's something else to accomplish your objectives, and you shouldn't let your self-esteem get in the way of getting those objectives. Again, keep your eyes on the prize. Let's work with Panama on this Chinese operator question. I think we can resolve it.
And that was John Bolton speaking to me there. Well, let's get some analysis on what he said. We can cross to Daniel Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, essentially the top US diplomat responsible for Europe, who joins us now from DC. Ambassador Fried, thank you very much indeed for joining us. You were listening in there to what John Bolton said, and I want to start by asking you if you agree that it's unlikely that force will be used to take control of Greenland or Panama, as John Bolton said.
I think it is unlikely. Donald Trump ran for president on a platform of getting the U.S. out of wars, not starting new ones. The notion that he would involve the U.S. in a costly war, which would end up in an occupation in Panama, and attack a NATO ally, Denmark, is a stretch at best. I think John Bolton was right. Trump likes to come in and overturn the table as an initial negotiating tactic. He likes to be the center of attention. And what he said last week has complicated U.S. objectives, probably set them back, and what purpose is achieved, I cannot say.
It sounded, talking to John Bolton, as though he doesn't exclude this Greenland idea, but what he disagrees with is Trump's communication and methodology here, his negotiating methodology.
Well, the problem is there is no reason at all why the United States needs to grab Greenland in 19th century style. What problem is Trump trying to solve? There is a security issue with the Russians and potentially the Chinese. The United States has military access to Greenland based on the 1951 agreement that Ambassador Bolton mentioned. So what problem exactly is Trump trying to solve by threatening Denmark? Where has Denmark and where has U.S.-Danish cooperation over Greenland fallen short? And if it has, Trump has not made the case. He hasn't even attempted to make the case. So what is the purpose of threatening Denmark? If there is an issue of inadequate implementation of the 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement, well, let's address it. The Danes have said they're willing to address this if it is a problem. I don't think it is. Now, on the question of Panama, there seems to be a genuine issue about Chinese influence, Chinese infrastructure in Panama. So let's deal with let's work with the Panamanian government about that. But by putting governments in a position of having to defend their sovereignty, Trump makes it harder for them to work with us in a constructive fashion. It's not remembered, but it ought to be, that in 1964 there were anti-American riots in Panama over ownership of the canal. Senator Barry Goldwater, hard right-wing, supported Jimmy Carter's efforts to return the canal, to give the canal back to Panama. And he did so because, as he said, his words, if we don't, we're going to be faced with guerrilla warfare. Now, this was a hard-headed, America First reason for not trying to continually occupy the Panama Canal in perpetuity. Barry Goldwater was right. John Wayne, who also supported the Panama Canal Treaty, was right. So I don't understand what President-elect Trump is trying to do. I'm in general agreement with Ambassador Bolton that it doesn't make any sense. And if there are issues with respect to Greenland and the Panama Canal, let's deal with those issues rather than overturning the table and then pretending that it's clever negotiating strategy.
Yeah, indeed. Panama is, of course, an ally of the United States. The president of Panama admires the United States and has expressed so on numerous occasions. But with regards to these Chinese concerns at the operating level of the Panama Canal, do you think those concerns are, in fact, legitimate?
I'm not enough of an expert in Panama Canal issues to be able to render some kind of judgment. If there are issues, the incoming administration needs to articulate them more than they've done, which is just sort of throw out accusations without any backup. If there is an issue of Chinese infrastructure control or ownership in Panama, okay, let's deal with that. But it's a massive and unproductive distraction to start talking about invading Panama to seize the canal. This sort of stuff doesn't work. The United States put such expansionism aside when, in 1918 and then after, it started championing a different way to advance American interests in cooperation with other countries. Now, despite all of America's blunders and mistakes and hypocrisies and inconsistencies, of which there have been many, American strategy of a new type, right? Sometimes it's called the rules-based order, but let's just call it a free world order, has worked out rather well, especially when we adhere to it. So going back to the 19th century is not apt to be productive. It puts us in a collision course with countries that otherwise, as you say, would be looking to us in friendship and willing to work with us.
So, sort of more broadly, Ambassador Fried, I mean, listening to some of what sounds like expansionist rhetoric coming from Donald Trump, and I should add Elon Musk, who looks like he's going to be a key feature of the second Trump administration, threatening Canada, making it the 51st state of the United States. I mean, what's your overall reading of this approach to foreign policy? What's the plan? Is there a plan?
I have two levels of answer. On one level, this is President-elect Trump trolling and making himself the center of attention and throwing things out and watching people scramble. So it's designed to gain some tactical advantage, to throw other countries off their game, and to create confusion and an atmosphere of intimidation to see what he can get. At a deeper level, Donald Trump seems to believe that a zero-sum world of power politics in perpetuity is better for American interests. I don't think so. I think that the genius of American strategy was that we would actually work with other countries, not because we were naive or not because we believed in charity, but because we believed that this would allow us to advance our interests more effectively. And the world that America built after 1945 demonstrates that that new theory of international relations, where we would work with other countries and thereby advance our interests, pretty successful, I would say. Trump wants to overturn that, and I don't think he will make it.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but really appreciate you speaking to us, Ambassador Daniel Fried. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.
After a 2-year vacuum, Lebanon has finally elected its new president, Lebanese army commander, President Joseph Aoun. I'm your host, Shadan Hammam, and my special guest today is former MP and businessman, Sami Fatfat. Hello, Mr. Fatfat. It's great to have you with us today, and congratulations on the election of the new president, putting an end to the political deadlock. Now, before we get into it, let's watch this clip together.
I pledge to exercise my role as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and President of the Supreme Defense Council so that I can work through them to confirm the state's right to monopolize the carrying of weapons.
Now, that was Lebanon's newly elected president, Joseph Aoun, delivering his inauguration speech in front of parliament. Now, Sami, as a Lebanese, how did that make you feel?
Well, we actually needed to hear this. I'm pretty sure that most Lebanese people felt goosebumps watching the president's speech. Personally, I felt a sense of relief. We have endured a lot, especially coming out of a very destructive war with Israel, and we needed some sort of hope and optimism. As for the issues, he spoke about reforming the judicial system and fighting corruption, disarming armed groups. These challenges we've been discussing for what feels like forever now. In 2019, there was an uprising in 17th of October 2019. This uprising, these issues were brought back to the forefront when the youth took to the streets and demanded change. At the time, the circumstances were very different, both regionally and domestically. But unfortunately, the movement failed, largely because we were under significant Iranian influence. For the first time in years, we feel like there's a solid chance to rebuild our country, and this really fills us with optimism for the future.
I want to dissect that speech a bit further. Aoun pledged to fight corruption and, more importantly, to disarm any group, an apparent allusion to Hezbollah. This is the first time a Lebanese president has ever made such a speech in his opening speech to parliament. What does it mean for Hezbollah and its political supporters?
It's clear that the balance of power in the region has shifted, and even within Lebanon, the public opinion has changed. In his speech, President Aoun explicitly said that the Lebanese army has the right to defend the country. Notably, all MPs clapped except Hezbollah's MPs, reflecting the overwhelming support of 90% of the Lebanese people for this stance. Historically, Hezbollah, let's say, were justified as three things: as a deterrent against Israel, a means to protect Lebanon, but also, let's say, a safeguard for the Shia community. However, none of the justifications have held true over time. Today, it's important to engage with the Shia community, and we have to assure them that while the regional dynamics are changing, no sect will be abandoned or marginalized. Rebuilding Lebanon requires the full participation of the Shia as an essential component in the country. Practically speaking, we have to say that Hezbollah's weapons no longer serve any function in this context. The collapse of the Syrian regime has severed their land, air, and sea connections with Iran, but also the destruction of the Syrian weapon factories has directly impacted Hezbollah resources. And that's a major problem for them.
So you think President Joseph Aoun kind of has like a leverage or a good starting point, given that Hezbollah has been targeted by Israel?
I think he has far less issues that any president had before, and that's due to his actions and the actions of many politicians that led to the state that we are today.
Do you truly believe that Hezbollah will agree to surrender all its arms to the Lebanese state? Can Hezbollah be content by just being a political group without its military power?
Well, they have to surrender their arms. Of course, here we are talking about a full implementation of the UN Resolution 1701. The 1701 implementation, first of all, is key to protecting the Lebanese army, and it's especially with the support with the of the UNIFIL. The resolution ensures that no armed groups other than the state security forces, such as the army and police, have the right to carry weapons in Lebanon. If the resolution 1701 is fully enforced, there will be no arms in Hezbollah's possession, and thus no potential clashes between Hezbollah and the army.
Speaking of clashes, President Aoun now faces a few daunting tasks, from overseeing a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel to save the country from its worst economic crisis. What do you think will be his biggest challenge?
Let's start by saying that President Aoun has set the bar very high, to be honest, and I'm very good with that. But so much that there's some Lebanese are saying that if he delivers like 30% of his speech, they will be very grateful. However, he will face significant obstacles, particularly from parties benefiting from the current state of lawlessness. The biggest challenge will be standing firm and refusing not to make compromises with any political factions. One of the most powerful statements he made was no one is above the law and no one is protected. This single sentence lays a foundation for building a state, and it marks the first step towards an independent judiciary.
Now, going back to the ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel, we can say that it's a fragile one. One of the conditions to preserve it is the deployment of the Lebanese forces along the southern border. So Aoun comes from a military background, which adds, an air of trust. However, do you think he can ensure that his troops are not caught in the crossfire between Israeli troops and Hezbollah?
If the resolution 1701 is enforced, there will be no arms with Hezbollah, thus no clashes between Hezbollah and the army. Additionally, we have to say that we are witnessing a significant U.S. pressure on Israel to withdraw from the occupied areas within the agreed upon time frame. In his last appearance, Hochstein was very clear about this point. The preamble of the latest agreement of the resolution of 1701 contains a critical statement that says no party in Lebanon shall possess weapons except the state security agencies, including the army, the internal security, the general security, but also they mentioned the municipal police.
Okay, so President Aoun is backed by the U.S. Can this mean that Lebanon might be entering an era of potential peace or even normalization ties with Israel?
I think it's too soon to speak about normalization with Israel. It's too early to discuss this. The Israeli is still seen as an occupying force or an occupier. However, the region is shifting, and it's shifting rapidly.
President Aoun did mention that he wants to grow the army to protect Lebanon against any Israeli attack.
And as a Lebanese citizen, we must focus on unity now and on rebuilding our devastated country.
Speaking of rebuilding, do you see a future in Lebanon where the diaspora are returning back?
In my opinion, we are entering a new phase, one that establishes the rule of law for all citizens. No one is above the law and no one is protected. This sentence alone is a good omen and the foundation for building a strong state. People are optimistic, and we hope we are really hoping for the best. I think in the near future, the mood will shift in the country, and I think, yes, in the near future, people will be coming back to Lebanon.
If you were president today, Sami, what would be your top priority on the agenda?
If I were president, first of all, I cannot be president. I can be prime minister. I'm a Sunni, so it's impossible for me to be president.
True.
But my top priority today is to attract foreign investments to Lebanon, reattract the youth that left Lebanon at the early stages, just to find a much more secure country, and to assure to everyone, to all citizens of Lebanon, that we do have the chance to rebuild this beautiful country again.
Recently, a heartfelt video of you reuniting with your Syrian uncle for the first time in years was circulating social media. Let's take a look.
عمك؟ 16 سنة ما شفته. تفضل.
Sami, tell us more about the story behind that video.
I actually went to Syria 3 days after the fall of the Assad regime. I went out of curiosity, and we have my father has a stepbrother in Syria that I've met when I was young, but I've never seen him since then. So I had the chance to connect with him, to contact him and to see him, and it was an amazing moment for me, and it was an amazing moment for him also. So he met me when I was like maybe 10 years old, and now seeing me again, going to Syria, and it was crazy. It was like a dream.
Were you bored from Syria? Is that why you haven't seen him in a long time?
I know for sure that my dad has a warrant against him by the Syrian government, by the ex-Syrian Assad regime. And when we used to speak publicly about the Syrian regime, I was very harsh on TV, and I was very loud regarding the atrocity of the Syrian regime. Mm-hmm. So I'm pretty sure that if I were to go there before the fall of the Assad regime, I would have major problems. But now that this regime is gone, both Lebanon and Syria have the chance to build amazing diplomatic relationship and civil relationship.
Former MP Mr. Sami Fatfat, it was a pleasure having you today.
Thank you.